we're going to start our landscape transformation basics class with a premise. Landscapes take up quite a lot of space in Southern California, actually. We might have more paving than we might otherwise want. Maybe some of our parking lots are too big, but if you look at an aerial photograph, like on Google Earth or something like that, of most of typical Southern California suburbs, you see something very different than New York City or downtown Los Angeles. There's quite a bit of green. And in a residential area, most of that is going to be grass, some trees as well. And specifically, if we think about the residential front yard, for most of the time, since a lot of these houses were built, we're talking about 1920s and especially into the 40s and 50s, kind of post-war construction boom through now. For a long time, the question has been, does the front yard fit in with the neighbors? And if someone wanted to go beyond that, really the only question was, what does it look like for most people? And so if it went beyond just that plain expanse of turf and maybe a tree, maybe there's some roses or a couple of lavenders, but it really, for most cases, kind of stopped there. And fortunately for us, the last series of droughts really opened up an opportunity for a new landscape question, which goes beyond what does it look like, which should be beautiful. Starting there, that's kind of the minimum. But we really can now ask ourselves, what do our landscapes do? What do we want them to do for us? What do they require of us? Is that worth it? And it's a pretty exciting time to be asking this question, because now in the vast majority of neighborhoods, there's no longer just one sort of accepted aesthetic or one style that a landscape has to be. Even in homeowners associations now, there's state level laws protecting people who want to take out their lawns and put in a Waterwise landscape. There might be requirements that you need to meet, but there are multiple different types of accepted landscapes now. And so we can ask ourselves, what do we want our landscapes to do for us? How do we want to use them? What services do we want them to provide for the world? And we can sort of embrace a much more exciting range of options for the precious space that we have in our front yards and our backyards. And so this is actually a picture taken sitting where I am now, which is the desk that I work remotely from at my house in Pomona, Southern California, overlooking a native plant garden. The last slide was my front yard as well, but this is specifically one of the things that my partner Kira and I designed our front yard to do, is to be a haven for local birds, butterflies, and pollinators. So this is a native songbird, Black Phoebe, who is a ferocious flycatcher, is a type of bird that loves to do this aerial acrobatics and pick bugs out of the sky. You can see he's caught a snack there. So this is just a branch that we dug into the ground, and it's a perch for him to look out into our front yard and find a snack and go for it. So we love having that around. That's one of the big things that we wanted our front yard to do. Your motivation might be very different, but it's much more exciting to consider than just what sort of grass you might want to put in. So that's one of the big ideas from this evening, is that California native and Waterwise landscapes can do more, whatever it is you want them to do. And they can cover lots and lots of different things, from being beautiful at a minimum. These are some of my favorite California native, easy to grow landscape plants that all happen to, in our area, not require water generally more than once a month. Once they're established, about once a week water at the beginning, and then much less after that. All sorts of different styles, from more desert style to more cottage garden. Lots and lots of color. And if you decide to work with native plants especially, those plants really provide lots of habitat for critters that we would love to have around most people, songbirds, butterflies, pollinators, and there are ones that really do need our help as well. There's lots of populations like the monarch butterfly, as you can see here, who are having real problems due to habitat decline. But even for species that you find aren't really on endangered or threatened lists, the numbers of those species over the last many decades, some of them have declined, half or more. So they may not be on those lists yet, but there's really a huge population decline problem. And whether we like a wilder aesthetic, which is totally ideal for wildlife gardening or habitat gardening, or you like something that's a little bit more clipped and cared for, working with native plants really invites lots of life into the yard, which is very exciting. You might end up with something like this, hummingbirds nesting in your yard, and get to enjoy all of that. And all of that together makes our yards much more enjoyable places to live and to learn. It's literally gardening this way, whether you have a smaller yard or a larger yard, can start to feel like you live in a park and you have that right outside your doorstep. Whether you're thinking about for yourself or for your kids or your grandkids who might come and visit or live with you, it really creates an incredible experience, which is always changing throughout the year. So with our lawns, even in the most ideal sense, we're putting in a lot of water. We're often putting down a lot of fertilizer if we're trying to keep it green. And then in the summer, someone, whether it's you or someone you're paying for, has to be out there pushing a lawnmower, working with the edger, trying to keep this like static picture that never changes. And that's not how nature wants to work. And so by embracing a Waterwise or a California native landscape, you get to embrace those seasonal changes. And in Southern California, if you work with a range of plants and you design it that way, you can always have something in bloom, and there's always something coming into bloom, and there's always something going out of bloom, different life cycles that are kind of part of the whole look. And it becomes really, really wonderful. And then the wildlife throughout the year changes. So some birds will hang out year round. Some birds, like the white-crowned sparrow, for example, in a lot of Southern California, comes down in the winter, hangs out in our yards. They're beautiful. They're cool to see. And around now, we think the ones that have lived in our yards for the last many months might have flown up to the San Gabriel Mountains this week, where they will spend the summer. And so you kind of get to tune into all of those cycles and see all of that take place. All of this together really starts to provide a unique sense of place to wherever you are if you're working with kind of locally appropriate landscaping. I really like this quote from Lady Bird Johnson. She was one of the first sort of high profile on a national scale proponents of gardening with native plants to the region where the gardener is, after typical mainstream gardening had really gone far away from that for quite a bit of time. And she said that native plants give us a sense of where we are in this great land of ours. I want Texas to look like Texas and Vermont to look like Vermont. I really like that quote. I'm more cynical than Lady Bird Johnson. The way I think about it, it costs a lot to live in California. And if I am lucky enough to live in Southern California and have a little bit of landscape where I can decide what happens there, why would I want my yard to be a lawn that's a parched imitation of an East Coast landscape style in the summer? That's generally not really what wants to grow here. I'd rather wake up to the natural beauty of California every day and enjoy it every evening. And I'm not telling you to be a good person, you need to take out all of your lawn by any means. There are some great purposes for a lawn. If you have kids or grandkids who are learning to walk or learning to play soccer, that's a great reason to have a lawn. But if your front yard and your backyard are both wall-to-wall lawn, then ask yourself, what part of your lawn are you actually using? Maybe you leave that and maybe you do something more interesting with the other parts of it. It's definitely not an all or nothing sort of situation. So just a couple of examples that I'm fond of. This is a picture of a front yard landscape that I visited on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour in 2018 in Pasadena. So very similar climate and soils to where we are on the western edge of San Bernardino County. So it's a relatively small front yard, and it was on a side street, but pretty close to a main street. And if this yard, when it was before this garden went in, just lawn, the house would feel pretty close onto the street, kind of a lot of traffic and noise. And by putting in this garden, not only is there beauty, not only is there color, not only is there habitat for native birds and butterflies, but it also creates a sense of structure that helps the house feel like it's kind of set back in its own little garden. It's kind of lovely. It's pretty simple, not a huge number of different plants that you can see in this picture, but some great choices. This was designed and installed by the homeowner. This was his first time doing anything like that. Very simple, inexpensive gravel path, kind of making a ring around the yard for access and to get in there and enjoy it. Absolutely lovely, totally changes the experience of the entire property. Or if your aesthetic is a little bit more formal, here is another. This is probably a 85 to 90% California native front yard, also in the San Fernando Valley. Here, this area that kind of looks like turf is an herbaceous native plant called yarrow. Probably gets watered about twice a month in the summer, still a lot less than a conventional lawn, and is covered in beautiful white flowers in the spring. And then you can see there's quite a bit of clipping to keep these plants kind of just so. And so if you like that, there's native and Waterwise plants that can meet that look as well. But where do you start? It's a huge question that I get. And here's another one of the big ideas from the evening. You don't start here. You don't start at the nursery. Even if it's a really good nursery with really knowledgeable staff, you still don't start at the nursery. Because what happens when you start at the nursery is you grab one of this and two of that, and that looks nice. It has a nice purple flower in the 1 gallon pot, but then you bring it home and you find out that it's going to be 12 feet wide. And if the label says it'll be 12 feet wide, it probably will, maybe only in a couple of years. Sometimes you might end up with too many plants that want full sun, where really you don't have that much full sun. Or maybe you'll have a plant that really wants part shade, and you're starting to realize that really all you have is sun. And so normally what happens is you end up coming home with kind of a mishmash of things. You plant them all out, and then immediately from day one, you're already at a disadvantage. If you planted too many plants too close together or the wrong sizes, then things are going to be growing into each other. Then you're going to need to start doing a lot more pruning than you otherwise would have to. It's more work. The plants aren't even going to look as good. This is all really, really common. I see this all the time. And so the plant part is hugely important, but that actually comes a little bit later. Where we start is with your goals. So what would be the perfect experience of a landscape for you, your perfect experience in your backyard? Don't worry about the plant choices yet. So this is the list of goals from one of the most difficult group of clients I ever had to work with. It's because they were my parents. I'd been doing landscaping for a while and used to people who wanted to work with me because they respected my opinions. And then there are really good turf removal rebates in the San Fernando Valley where my parents are. And my dad had never really been interested, but finally gave me the call. So I took the project on with them. And my dad's goals were actually pretty easy. His goals were whatever makes your mom happy. My mom had a lot of goals for a pretty small backyard. So this is the list of goals for the backyard. A comfortable place to sit and read, a place that feels relaxing, the sound of water, something that's relatively simple to maintain, something to hide the less than attractive cinder block wall around the entire backyard without spending a lot of money, something to attract birds, something that looks nice, finds a space to grow vegetables, and crams all of that in while still making a small space feel bigger. I commend her for thinking through her goals. We can do all of this through an intentional kind of process of design, but we can never accomplish this if we hit the nursery and start buying plants first. So we have resources to help with the plant selection part. Stay tuned. So just to show you very briefly how that project came together, this is April 2015. You can see the backyard lawn had already been ripped out at this stage. Here is planting day, and this is actually a kind of high density of plants because we went with a meadow with some accents. So some of these grasses are pretty small. Some of the plants were going to get larger, and some of these just to help with my parents being worried about things looking too sparse, actually were planted a little close together, and we had to pull things out over time as things started to grow in. So here is planting getting started, and just did this layout very simply: stake, a strap, kind of holding it at a certain distance, rotating it around to get our perfect circles, just using an old bag of flour to just kind of trace out our main shapes, make sure we liked it, adjust things as we needed to, walking through, looking at all the plants, picturing how they'll grow into the best we could, and then getting them in the ground following our design concept. So that's it immediately after planting. We're still going to finish putting our water feature in the middle. Simple pathway just defined as the areas where there were wood chips and no plants. And this is the point where most people look at their yard and think, oh my God, I should have bought way more plants. I should have bought them way larger. This looks like a sea of mulch. What am I going to do? Should I go back to the nursery? If you've done your research, if you've worked through all the steps we're going to talk about, you just wait a little bit because it's going to grow and it will grow relatively quickly. So this was April with the planting, and this is October of the same year. It's a garden. It doesn't take that long for things to get going. So don't overplant. Look up the size that your plants are going to get and respect them. And so we went with the simple kind of Mediterranean meadow concept, working mostly with this one native grass-like plant, Berkeley sedge, that does great in part shade or can take full sun with as long as it gets some afternoon shade, which is what it gets here. And working with other California friendly Mediterranean plants. And so one of the ways we're able to meet all those goals is we kept it pretty simple. A lot of repetition of a main plant, which is the sedge, and then accents. And so you can see here, we have the sound of water. We have the place to sit and read, the bench over here that's starting to be shaded by these small trees in the picture. Here's from the bench looking back at the patio connected to the house. So a pretty narrow yard, but by thinking about the goals, thinking very intentionally about where each part of that goal should physically manifest in the garden, and then spacing things accordingly, not going too crazy with the plant diversity, helping keep it easy to maintain, another one of those goals, we're able to meet it. Room for the one vegetable bed you can see here, looking back towards the old lemon tree, which is one of the two trees that was in the yard. Everything else pretty much was turf. And if you build it, they will come. So just by providing a little bit of water, falcon coming down for a drink in the middle of pretty urban Van Nuys, California. You can see the simple vine that we were growing, a creeping fig. It's a thug. It will grow over anything, including a cinder block wall. So these days it takes a little bit of work trimming it at the top, but some of the neighbors love the fact that it started to creep into their backyards as well, because they don't like their cinder block walls either. So working out quite well. And with seasonal pops of color. So here you can see mixing in Australian kangaroo paws and South African red hot poker, as well as the bearded iris in the front, not in bloom in the picture. So from different similar to California Mediterranean climates. Doesn't need to be rocket science. It's a pretty logical process. And if you want to learn more about that process of kind of very logically setting goals, moving through those goals to create a design, I would encourage you to check out our full do-it-yourself landscape design workshop, which is on our YouTube channel. It's the same place where you can see the recording of this. And I'll be mentioning a number of other workshops that we have on our YouTube channel. So I'm going to type it into the chat now. That's cbwcd.org/YouTube. Brings you right to the playlist of our past workshop recordings. And so let's look at some inspiration of some other native and climate appropriate garden styles. You'll notice that a number of these are credited to things on the Theodore Payne Foundation Native Plant Garden Tour. I want to give them credit because credit is definitely due for them allowing me to use these pictures. Theodore Payne Foundation is a nonprofit located in the San Fernando Valley, Southern California, dedicated to promoting native plants. And quite a bit of that is done through native plant horticulture and making sure that people are growing these plants. In support of that mission, they do a big garden tour every year. This year, it is all online, and they've done a lot of filming beforehand, working with different properties, so you can still get a garden tour experience. And that is actually happening this weekend. It is currently April 15th, so that is April 17th and 18th. You can check out that at nativeplantgardentour.org. But also, even if you're not going to join that, when you go to that page, they have great photography of many, many years of past gardens that were on the tour. So you can check them out. And in addition to looking at plants, you can just see the approaches that people have used for setting up patio spaces and all sorts of different kind of areas of front yards and backyards. So it's a wealth of inspiration, help you figure out what you might like for your yard. And so, for example, this yard is kind of a minimal modern yard. This is that same Berkeley sedge, but planted closer together, kept lower, with just some simple grass, as well as a native tree, a sycamore over here, and a native redbud over here. Really kind of nice and modern. Get to start thinking about patio spaces. This is actually at the California Botanic Garden, but a lovely patio space anchored by a native Palo Verde tree, as well as other patio spaces. And you'll see a lot of these sorts of landscapes use permeable materials, which might be that decomposed granite, it might be gravel, it might just be wood chip mulch, but not large expanses of concrete. Not only is that easier and cheaper to install, something like this feels nice underfoot. It's nice how it can kind of organically morph from near the plants to the social space and back. And then in addition, when water falls on it, it can soak in right where it falls in most soil types. So it's not like concrete where that water needs to wash somewhere and then off the side of the concrete, you need to deal with a large amount of water. It can kind of evenly soak in. And from the larger plants at the edges of the patio space, their roots will creep underneath into that area below the surface, not at the very top, and they will get some of that hydration as well. You often start to see patio spaces show up in front yard landscapes as well, as people think about what they want from their space and realize that they can have much more functional spaces than a neglected lawn. Here's another picture from that more formal driveway landscape. Or it can be very modern. I really like the design here where it's very modern and angular with the pavers, but then that allows for a very naturalistic and sort of wild planting, a mix of wildflowers, native perennials, and some trees. Or very naturalistic with this decomposed granite pathway lined by river rock and a kind of meadowy native landscape. And if you are in Southern California, rebates are available to help make it happen. And so for most of us in Southern California, the main resource for rebates is going to be this website SoCalWatersmart.com. That is the website that is maintained by the Metropolitan Water District, who is the main water importer and wholesaler, which if your water agency gets any amount of imported water, which the vast majority of them in Southern California do, it's going to be through the MWD. And so as a simple way for people to have one main website to go to, they administer this website no matter who your water provider is. And here you can find information about a number of different rebates. The main one that people are interested in, if you have any sort of lawn left, even if it doesn't look great, is the turf replacement program, where if you remove turf, even if it's pretty brown, as long as you get your project approval before you start doing any work, you remove turf and you put in a new landscape that meets all the requirements, and we'll talk about what those are, you get money back per square foot. So you'll literally get a check for the number of square feet you've been approved for the project area. They also have rebates for what are called weather-based irrigation controllers. This is a newer generation of sprinkler timers, irrigation controllers. Same thing, it's the little thing that's in a lot of people's garages. Sometimes it's mounted outside. It's what tells the irrigation system or the sprinklers when to come on and off. And there are newer ones that either have a local device that tells it the weather, or the best ones, in my opinion, are ones that if they can get onto your home Wi-Fi network, can access a kind of whole host of local weather stations and automatically adjust themselves based on what the weather is. The ones that are Wi-Fi ones also have a lot of other advantages. They're much more intuitive to program because you can do all of that programming from a computer or from a phone app, and it's not like trying to program an old VCR or something like that. It's much clearer what you need to do to get the desired results. You still need to do some learning to set it up correctly. We have workshops that talk about that, but they are really a huge improvement compared to the last generation of irrigation controllers. And so $80 plus are the rebates on those. Sometimes there's a base rebate, and then sometimes the local water agencies will kick in more. So in our local area, the rebates, for example, $160 on the weather-based irrigation controller. And then rotating sprinkler nozzles. We'll talk a little bit about those when we talk about retrofitting irrigation systems for our Waterwise gardens. But just note that if you are going to replace all your sprinkler nozzles with more efficient ones, if you have a large enough property where you're doing at least 30 of them, there's a $2 minimum. That won't pay for the whole thing, but it'll make a difference. And then, for example, locally in the area that we serve, it's a $5 nozzle refund. So if you do 30, that's a $150 refund. And for those of you who are in our immediate local communities that we serve, for customers who get their water from Monte Vista Water District, City of Ontario, Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Fontana, or the City of Upland, those water agencies also have a local program where you can qualify to have that smart or weather-based irrigation controller installed at your house completely for free, covering the cost of the unit and also the landscape contractor who will come and install that. It goes through a single contractor that they have a contract with. And so basically how it works is you take a short class, which is now online, answer a couple of questions, and then you can qualify for signing up for that program. If you are interested in that, and I would very much encourage you to be, you start by contacting the conservation staff member at your local water provider. Some water providers have a water conservation page where you can find that information, but you can always just call the main customer service number, tell them that you heard about the free weather-based irrigation controller program, and you want to know how to get hooked up with it, and they should be able to help you out. One quick note, they do come out to make sure that you have a relatively functional irrigation system. So if your system is all busted up and a bunch of broken pipes and things like that, to where putting in this better timer is still not going to help save water, they will tell you what you need to fix first in order for you to then qualify for them to come back and do that. And then finally, the turf replacement rebate, which is the main one if you have any semblance of a lawn that can really help you pay for a renovation project. You basically qualify per square foot for the number of square feet of turf you're removing, up to 5,000 square feet. And that's 5,000 square feet per fiscal year, as long as they still have more funds the next year. So their fiscal year runs from July through June. And so, for example, if you do your front yard and complete that project one year, you can apply to do your backyard the next year, as long as there's still funding. In any area that qualifies for the rebate, it starts at a minimum of $2 a square foot. And then again, sometimes local water agencies are increasing the amount wherever you are. You can find out what your rebate is. So for example, most of our service area, it's $3 a square foot, and Monte Vista Water District is the highest for residential landscapes at $3.50 a square foot. And when you go onto the SoCalWatersmart.com webpage, there's an estimate my rebate area. So you can put in all your information and it will give you that information so you can know what to expect. We work with a lot of people who are going through these rebates. And so we've learned kind of where people get confused. And I want to provide you with some top tips and tricks related to this. And then we will move back into more general design information. So for those of you who don't qualify for this rebate, hold on. We will be getting back to information that's going to be relevant for everybody. But here's some information for those of you who are going to be applying. If you happen to be involved with a local community project or a local business as well, you will qualify for either that $2 or $3 a square foot. And all of these same things apply for commercial or For example, if you have a church that you're involved with, you're taking out the turf. All these same requirements that we're about to cover are the same, no matter what the property type is. Hugely important thing. You cannot begin any work on your project until after you have received approval for your rebate, if you want to receive your rebate. Basically, you need to provide them when you apply for your rebate with documentation that you have a lawn. Again, doesn't need to be beautiful or even green. And they do actually come out and spot check to make sure that everything is legit with all of the applicants. They can't come to every address, but they spot check about 10%. And so if they come out and you've already ripped out your lawn, you won't qualify for the rebate, because it is a rebate to incentivize people to go ahead and make the decision to take out that lawn. It's not just to help people plant pretty gardens who maybe don't have a lawn to begin with. So that's crucially important. From when you apply, it's about a week or two till you hear back with your official approval. So the process is to go to SoCalWatersmart.com, under available rebates, select turf replacement program, read through all of that detailed information. It's all really important to know what you're getting into, but here are some tips. They are going to ask you, you create your own login, so you don't need to put everything in at once. You can go back, you can save as you go. One of the things you're going to need to tell them is the total lot size. So not just the area of turf you're taking out, but the total property lot size. And a lot of people don't have that immediately handy. You can find that easily by typing the address into any search engine. And what's going to happen is, for most addresses, the first number of things that will come up will just be real estate websites. They just have the system that automatically generates profiles of every single property. And so you can click on them, doesn't matter which one. Where they have that information you're looking for is going to be different. But just for one example, I typed in, which is a large property, the property that we own and have a number of facilities, including our demonstration garden. And so here you have the lot size. Ours was shown in acres. However, for most lots, it'll be shown in square feet. You'll also have to have already decided which areas of your turf you're going to be removing and putting in your new garden, and how many square feet each for front yard, side yard, and or backyard, and the number of square feet that's going to be removed in each one. The rebate will pay per square foot up to 5,000 square feet. This may or may not cover the entire cost of your project, depending on many factors. We'll talk more about that later on. If you want to plant more than 10 feet or renovate, more than 5,000 square feet at a time, you can. You'll just only receive up to 5,000 square feet of rebate. And you can also replant or renovate areas that are not currently turf. Like if turf is adjacent to planter beds, you can design and redo that all at once. They're just only going to give you the rebate for the square feet of turf being removed. If you can measure the areas of turf by hand, if they're pretty simple shapes, if that's manageable, that's always going to be the most accurate. However, we do work with a lot of people that have funny shaped areas of turf. And one way you can try to get a good measurement of that, system works pretty well, is by using Google Maps, like the website where you just use to get directions or something. It's just maps.google.com, or if you just type in Google Maps, you'll get there. If you type your address into Google Maps, it'll bring up basically a map with a pin on that address. In the lower left-hand corner, there will be something that says satellite, and you can click on that. It's a little square, and it will bring up an aerial photograph kind of view that they have of almost the entire world at this point. Definitely anywhere where any of you are. From there, you can zoom in as close as possible to the area where you're going to be removing your turf, and you'll see a pretty good resolution picture there. It's kind of scary how much information is available to anyone, but it's very useful as a landscape design tool. Once you have that set up, you can right-click, and it will bring up a little menu, and you can click measure, and then you can literally just do a connect the dots measurement over the area of turf you want to remove. When you click the last dot, kind of making the full outline, there will be a little box at the bottom that tells you the area, and it's pretty accurate from most of the sites that we've tried it with. So you're going to need to figure out that area. You're also going to need to install and tell them which stormwater retention feature approach you're going to use. So what that means is, in addition to putting in low water plants, they're really providing these rebates to make sure people put in exemplary landscapes. And what that means in the year 2021 is low water plants as part of it, but also doing something in your landscape so that when it rains, instead of all the water coming off your property and then eventually like leaving and just going out through the storm drain system, that they want you to put in a feature that's going to intentionally capture some extra water that would otherwise maybe not be captured. So whether it's water coming down from a roof, which is usually the main thing, or washing off a driveway, or preventing it from running off the landscape in some other way, you have to put in something. And so it's something like, here's the choices they have: a rain garden, a rock garden, a dry riverbed, swales, berms, rain barrels, cisterns. They have examples of all of them. But think something like a dry creek bed, like you see on the right. We'll talk a little bit more about that. That's kind of the most common approach and what makes the most sense, in my opinion, for most people. And then finally, you're going to need to tell them the total number of plants to be planted as part of the project. Basically, they have a minimum requirement. So you can't just put in wall-to-wall gravel and a couple of cacti. It's not going to be something that you'll be happy with. It's not going to be something that is an asset to the community overall. They really want these to be exemplary landscapes. That's why they are providing the rebate. They are not only providing the rebate for water conservation. Each individual landscape would not conserve enough water to make it economically viable for them to bribe people to be doing that one at a time. So what they're doing is essentially encouraging people to use the rebates to put in these exemplary landscapes to gently start to change the look of Southern California and see the things that people are seeing in front yards and backyards. So needs to meet all the requirements. And essentially that requirement is to have at least 3 plants per 100 square feet of turf being removed. It's a really easy requirement to make. Depending on the plant size, it might be that, but most of the time, if you just plant a nice garden, it's going to be higher than that anyways. And then finally, you'll also need to upload some pretty basic stuff: copy of your recent water bill, copy of your landscape plan. Don't let that copy of your landscape plan be intimidating. They are very liberal with what they will accept for a landscape plan. I've seen some of the things that they accept, and it looks like a 7-year-old drew them. It doesn't need to be a work of art. It doesn't need to be exactly to scale on graph paper if that's not what you're into. It doesn't need to have every single plant identified. It really needs to show them that you've put in some thought, that you basically have roughly drawn out your landscape, the area that you're going to do, like where your water feature is going to be, the kinds of plants you have, but it doesn't need to be a professional plan. Uploading a picture of that. And then you can formally request your approval. You will have 180 days after your approval to complete the project. After you complete the project, you will upload through the same login your photos of your completed project, and then you formally request your rebate. Same thing, a week or two for them to get back to you with the fact that it's approved. They might send somebody out to inspect, they might not. And then after processing time, you will receive your check. Very important thing to note is federal law. Rebates over $600 are federally taxable. So you will get from MWD, the agency that cuts the checks, in January of the next year, you will get a 1099 form where anything over $600 will be on your federal taxes, something that you do need to claim as income. So it is still a great deal, but really wanted to always include that because sometimes that's easy to miss in all the fine print. But if you get your $15,000 check for removing 5,000 square feet of turf in some areas, part of that will be taxable just based on whatever your tax rate is for your federal taxes. And so here is just an example of my yard when I was doing the turf replacement rebate. Hadn't watered for a long time. They don't want you to water to, green it all up and make it beautiful, but you can see how all of that thatch is there. That's still turf. Whereas if it was just dirt, it wouldn't be approvable, because if I did start watering this grass would not be beautiful, but it would green back up. So that's just one example. And when you provide them the pictures of your current site, they need to be something like this. It can't be a close-up of a plant. It's some sort of angle where there's a bit of your house or your garage in the back. It could be verified theoretically that it is your property. And so next we're going to talk about that stormwater retention feature, but I've seen some questions come in. So let's answer some questions and keep them coming in if you have any. So from Paul, is the rebate for removing turf and replacing with vegetation only, or can it be a replacement of both hard and landscape? So it's a good question. So in the area of turf coming out, hardscape like pathways, patio spaces, things like that can go in if two requirements are met. The first requirement is that any of that hardscape that goes in needs to be permeable. So like we talked about before, it needs to be something where if rainwater falls directly on it, it can be absorbed into the ground. So like if you do a patio that's that decomposed granite material, which is considered permeable, or gravel, that will be fine. If you use pavers, as long as it's not like on top of concrete and it's not mortared, but if it's pavers with like sometimes people do decomposed granite or gravel in between, so that as soon as the water falls onto it, as soon as it hits the end of the paver, it goes in between the cracks, that can work as well. But if it's like tight brickwork or concrete, that does not qualify. And then the other thing that needs to be met is that the 3 plants per 100 square foot requirement is for the total project area. So for example, if you were doing a 1,000 square foot yard of turf that you were taking out, so 1,000 square feet, 3 per 100 square feet, that means 30 plants you need to put in. So if in that 1,000 square foot yard, you put in a 100 square foot gravel patio, that's just fine, as long as over the total project area, you still are putting in those 30 total required plants. So it can be more dense in some areas, less dense in other areas, and no plants in some other areas, as long as the total number of plants required is met. So hopefully that makes sense, but if not, send in another question and I will look at some other questions. From Mark, do you bring in cover dirt to prevent weeds? Normally you wouldn't put dirt over it to prevent weeds. If you already have a lot of weed seeds, you might take one of the approaches that we're going to talk about in the turf removal part, or you might use mulch, like a wood chip mulch, or sometimes even a decomposed granite or gravel mulch. But normally just if you have a lot of weeds, just putting dirt on the top won't really do much. And oftentimes the dirt you would bring in might not be better than the soil you already have. Okay, from Leslie. My rebate was approved. Can I provide contractors to use? So we are trying to figure this out right now. It's a very common question. As a public agency that gets tax funding, we have to be very careful, and right now don't have a method where we can recommend individual private contractors. I will say something that some people have done is at that web page where you can download the slides from this evening, which is cbwcd.org/presentations. Presentations, I just typed that into the chat. We do have a list you can download of local landscape suppliers. So that is if you are on that like western edge of San Bernardino County, eastern edge of LA County. And within there, either the landscape supply places or the nurseries that we say what type of plants they sell. Some of those, because the private businesses can recommend contractors. I have no comment on the quality of those contractors, but we'll talk about working with contractors later and kind of questions to ask and that sort of stuff. Or you also might try asking locally. You might try Nextdoor or Angie's List or something like that. We are hoping within the next year to come up with something that passes muster with our lawyer, where we can at least like facilitate people to share their experiences with contractors in the local area, but that's taken quite a while to kind of get going. Okay, from Anonymous. I suppose I'm asking the same question in another way. I have about 10,000 or about 1,000 square feet of asphalt between my home and the garage, and I want to pull up and make permeable to rainwater. Can I get a rebate on that? It's not turf, but non-environmentally friendly. Okay, good question. No, you cannot. That's just when these programs are set up, they generally have a pretty narrow scope of things, and it's not a general program to encourage environmentally friendly gardening. It'd be great if there was one, but this is a specific one from water agencies to encourage people to take out turf, which requires a ton of water, and then put in these gardens that do all these great things and also require less water. So there aren't rebates to do that right now to help pay for it, but it would be a great thing to do. If you are within our local service area, I will talk about our landscape design assistance program later on. And if you are in that local area, we could help you with the design of what to do there if a landscape is going to go in. But in terms of a rebate to pay for it, I am not aware of any. I don't think that there is one right now for hardscape. Okay, so on this, whether or not you are doing the rebate or not, if you are thinking about redesigning a garden space, it's good to think about is there a way to hold on to some of the stormwater that falls on your property, maybe coming off of your roof. Good for a number of reasons. First one is that it can help actually improve local water quality by reducing the amount of water that hits our local city streets and also the volume at the beginning of a storm event. It actually helps local surface water quality. Like for our area, our basins actually capture some of that water and recharge it into the groundwater. But anything that goes by eventually ends up down in a wetland area called Prado Basin, which is home to a number of threatened or endangered species. So it's good for all of us to keep the water coming out of our neighborhoods as clean as possible, as unpolluted as possible. And installing these sorts of features actually does help with that a little bit. Holding on to that water also helps in a smaller rain event, give your garden a little bit of a better soak, at least for the plants immediately near it. And then finally, in our area, big time, but in a number of other areas, they're also needing to start relying more and more on their local groundwater supply, but doing it in a sustainable way, which means that the level of the water is tracked and they need to make sure that it doesn't go down. And so by absorbing water into the ground, eventually that water will help recharge the local groundwater. No one property is going to make the whole solution itself. But if every time a landscape is renovated, something is done to hold on to a little more of that water, over time, that's really going to start to create a paradigm shift. And so for all of those reasons, if you're getting a rebate, that's why you have to do something. So we are mostly going to talk about holding water and getting it into the ground. A rain barrel or a cistern, which is essentially a large rain barrel that's hundreds and hundreds of gallons or larger, is technically an option to meet the rebate requirements, but you have to have rain gutters all the way around your house. And it's not as simple as just buying the rain barrel that costs $100 and putting it down, because you also need to modify the downspout of your rain gutter to get water into that barrel. And a 55-gallon, which is typical 55-gallon, 60-gallon rain barrel, actually doesn't make that much of a difference in a landscape. Just to provide some context, in a 1-inch rain event, like if you hear it rained an inch last night, I haven't heard that very much this year, but in a 1-inch rain event on a 1,000 square foot roof, that will produce over 620 gallons of water coming off of that roof. So your 55-gallon rain barrel fills instantly. And what happens to the rest of it? It overflows. Now, conversely, even in a very low Waterwise garden, normally what happens once it's established is it's watered about the equivalent of an inch of rain over it in terms of the volume once a month in the summer. So even in a very low water garden, the first time it needs to be watered, which might not be for a couple of months after it rains, it's going to take about 620 gallons of water to water it well. So again, that 55 gallons is not going to do that much. And then you need to distribute it evenly and slowly over the landscape. So rain barrels, if you're into it, if you have one and you like it, I'm not trying to knock you. Most people I know who have rain barrels and like them do it in addition to doing other things to have water stay on their property. And they will basically use it to fill a watering can and water like some potted plants on their patio or something like that. And it's a good use for that. It also comes with a lot of responsibility. Rain barrels come with screening basically to keep mosquitoes out of that standing water. And if that screening is not maintained, or if there's any tears or it's not aligned right, you have 55 gallons of mosquito habitat right outside your house. So the more kind of viable solution for most of us, and ends up being lower maintenance long-term, is to do something like a dry stream bed. This is part of my rainwater harvesting system at my house. Right when we were getting it started, we don't have roof gutters on the house, and the eaves have this weird curve on the end, which would make putting in the gutters pretty difficult. And so the water just falls off the house and right into this dry stream bed. And if there's a lot, there's a slight slope that kicks it out that way. And it doesn't necessarily, to meet the rebate requirements, need to be that much bigger than that. You might want something wider. This eventually goes to an area where we can have a lot more capacity to capture water somewhere else. But this is a start, that kind of going for a little while. And so just as an example for what we did at our house to meet the rebate requirements, and also because it's a good thing to do, it starts with that. And then when it comes along this path area, we put in what's called a French drain, which is basically just, we didn't have room to do a whole dry stream bed. So it's just a trench about 1 foot wide and 1 foot deep that's filled with gravel, and a small amount of rain that'll just soak in right there. And a large amount of rain, it will actually follow the slope of the landscape, slightly sloped on the bottom along with the path out this way, goes underneath the path. We just dug out an area underneath, around to the side, and then in a large storm event actually goes all the way around to the backyard where we have more room and it can go into this more natural dry stream bed. And so to plan out how this might work at your house, one really quick thing is, depending on the size of your house, you don't always have the options, but it is a best practice for that final area where water is going to really be allowed to sink in, to have that be at least 10 feet from your building foundations. You don't want your foundations really to be in the wet zone. So for example, it's not something that I really worry about with the area along here where just a little water trickles in. This whole area used to flood before we put this in anyways, so it's much better than it was for many decades. But for something big like that, generally you don't want it right next to your house if you have another option. So how to figure this out? Starts with observation. Doesn't need to be rocket science. Take a look at your yard. If you have seen it in a number of rain events, that is really ideal. It's really hard to figure this out if you've just kind of moved into the house and haven't been there through a rain. Look at your yard. Where does the water come from? How much water? Is it just a little bit of a trickle, or is it really a lot of water coming down and you have to do something about it? It's been an issue for a while. How does it move through the property? Is there somewhere where it already stagnates? Does it fill up against the house, the foundation of the house, and you need to get that water out of there and find a place where it can be useful? Or does it end up somewhere in the backyard at a low point anyways, where maybe it's more just about digging it out for more capacity and making it look nice because you already have a logical low spot where the water goes? We see all of those things. It really just depends on your situation. So here is one example of a home in Pasadena. And one of the things I like, they used a number of techniques. In the front that they did is, it's kind of hard to see here. There actually is a roof gutter that's painted with the rest of the patio along here, capturing water from this part of the house. And instead of the downspout, they took that off and they put in what's called a rain chain, which is this thing right here, which has a couple of advantages over a traditional downspout. First advantage is that it looks a lot nicer than a typical metal or PVC downspout. But the second advantage is that it's actually functional. So as the water comes down, it bounces off of each link in this rain chain. And as it does that, it slowly dissipates some of the velocity of that water coming off the roof, so that by the time it gets to the garden level, it's actually moving a little bit slower. It's less likely to hit the ground and be pulling away soil and mulch and all that sort of stuff. And so we say when we're thinking about water through the garden, we want to slow it down, spread it out, and that'll help let it sink in. And so this is the beginning of the slowing it down part. Here it goes into an ornamental pot with a wider hole dug in the bottom. Totally optional. It's pretty, but definitely not necessary. And then underneath that, though, there's just a small area, maybe 2 feet wide of gravel. So that, again, when that water hits the ground, it's not hitting soil right away, hits the gravel. Some of it soaks in, but basically most of it's going to go out into the garden, but it's moving a lot slower and a lot more of it's going to absorb. Along the side of the house, there's an area where the typical rain gutter still continued to make sense. But when it comes down, it still hits this piece of concrete, dissipates some of that velocity, kicks it over here, so it's not picking up soil, into this, which is also a French drain. If you are going to use a French drain approach, which is usually used in narrow areas where there's not room for like a wider dry stream bed, just that trench that's then filled with a wide gravel. You don't want to use really small gravel because the water moves through and is held in the air spaces in between each piece of gravel. So the bigger the gravel, the better. Usually it's about 1.5 to 2 inch size gravel that's used. And then you can mix in some other sizes to help it look nice. You won't see French drain listed on the different approaches for the rebate, but it definitely qualifies. I've been involved with a number of rebate projects that use that technique. You can just choose a dry stream bed or dry creek bed or whatever seems the closest, and it'll be just fine. And so from here, it goes down through here. I like the use of the old terracotta roofing tiles, recycled to be some edging here, some native plants just starting to grow in. And you can see it goes around the side, safely away from the basement where they used to have flooding problems and need a sump pump. After this system went in, they didn't need it anymore. Goes along here. You can see it dug underneath the existing concrete walk. If your concrete walk is in really bad shape and has a bunch of cracks and things like that, might not be a good idea. But in most cases, if the concrete walk is in pretty decent shape, then it can handle being dug underneath in just one area. And then oftentimes you'll just put a pipe in there to kind of keep the soil stabilized as it goes underneath. Out to the other side, safely around the house, where it can go into this wider infiltration area. And then if there's a huge storm and more water needs to go somewhere, this can safely overflow, trickle through the landscape, and worst case scenario, safely around the house and just down into the street, into the normal kind of gutter system. So this aesthetic, this kind of very vibrant wildflower meadow, very naturalistic, might not be what you like. It might be what you like. I think it's beautiful, but it's not for everyone. But the principles of the rainwater harvesting stuff can be applied to any sort of aesthetic. And so here's just a few more examples of working with different kinds of rock and planting. So these can absolutely become garden features. And what I recommend is work with the local stone, gravel to wherever you are. So in most of Southern California, it's this kind of largely granite kind of river rock. Couple of reasons. One, it's the most affordable. It is often with rock you pay by weight, and the local stuff is usually about 1/3 of the kind of quote more exotic or ornamental stuff in terms of cost. So you're going to pay a lot less. Other reason is that it tends to just look better in place and more natural, especially with something like this. One of the keys to making it look nice and natural is to use different sizes. So from small rock to a few larger. Some people with big budgets might put in large boulders. Normally, I don't do that. For me, it's anything that's hard for me to move around in anything other than a wheelbarrow is not going to come into my yard. So working with cobble, through a couple of small boulders down to gravel. And you can get stuff that kind of matches when you're working with the local river rock through all of that. And it's affordable. Most of the other exotic stuff, you can kind of only get one size. And so it's very expensive. And then once you put it out into a landscape and you build something the size of a dry stream bed, it looks weird if it's all one size. So just showing another common situation where the garage is downhill or downslope from the driveway. So a lot of water comes down. Perfect spot to allow the water, if there's a slight cross slant, which usually there is in the pavement, to really allow that to not get stuck, kick out to the side. Some absorbs, but it's able to come around to a place that can really accommodate. So saw a couple of questions come in. So from Anonymous. So the slope keeps the water away from the foundation walls of your home so that the walls aren't damaged by the moisture. So it all depends on how things are set up. Like in my situation, my house is downslope from the street. And so before I put that system in, I would have lots of water that pooled up against the base of the house. Very lucky that the house didn't seem to have any damage from it, even though it's 60 years old. But we changed that right away after we got through our first series of storm events. And so the system that we have now, so that's the primary slope, but there is a little bit of a cross slope. And so what we did is we put this system in that captures the water kind of along the primary slope. It keeps it from pooling up against the house, and it pitches it just a little bit to the side, which is enough in a large rain event to get it over and around the side of our house and out into our backyard when we need it to. But it's all just going to be site dependent. It's about kind of following the path the water is going to take, where does it end up, and just thinking about what your options are. We do have a full workshop about that. It's a 3-hour workshop called Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes that gets way more into it, more examples, and that's on our YouTube page as well. So if you're thinking about doing that, it's whether you're hiring someone to do it and it's the cost, or whether you are going to be doing it yourself, in which case it might not cost that much, but it's a lot of labor. I'd encourage you to check out that workshop. It can be a well-spent investment in time if you pick up even just a couple of tips or tricks on how to most successfully do that. Okay, so with that, you've now started to think about what your goals are for your project. You're starting to think about how water moves through the property. As you've started to think about that, in a lot of people's cases, now you're kind of thinking, well, maybe I'll have a patio space over there. And maybe just because of where the water comes from and how it comes off the roof, my dry stream bed will go through here. And over in this one area is going to be the place where logically that water is going to soak in. That's going to start to make it a little bit easier to choose your plants, actually, because when you're just looking at a big empty area and thinking, oh my God, there's so many different plants I could choose from, what do I do? It's more intimidating. But once you've started to think about any of the other features that you've wanted, your goals, where any of those social spaces are going to go, the areas to fill with plants are going to start to get a little bit more defined. Maybe if you know you have a patio space, you know that you're going to want a single small tree near it. So there's one tree, and then next to that, maybe just based on the space, there's going to be room for a couple of medium-sized shrubs. We're going to get more into that, but you can kind of start to see why the plant choices come a little bit later in most cases. And so as you're getting into choosing plants, it's going to be time to do some fun research. A lot of people, this part is pretty exciting. And when you start looking at pictures, you might start to fall in love with a bunch of different plants. At this point, remind yourself to keep it relatively simple. Don't put in too many plants and crowd them. That will make it a lot harder to achieve a beautiful look and will make it a lot more maintenance. The plants won't be as happy. For most people who we work with, they don't want to become people who, like, gardening is their number one hobby. If that's for you, that's great. That's kind of the kind of people that me and my partner are. And that really influences the style, especially in our backyard, of gardening that we do. But for most people, they don't want to become garden experts. Most people just want to have a nice garden that's relatively low maintenance, provides some color, maybe brings in some butterflies and songbirds, and you can have that all. But don't put in too many different plants. And then you have to learn about each of them and their maintenance, or kind of train your gardener how to take care of each one. For most people, average size front yard or backyard, we are looking at 10 to 20 different plant choices total, including trees, shrubs, smaller perennial plants, maybe some grasses. And if you wanted it to be less than 10, it easily, with well-selected plants, could be less than 10 and be absolutely lovely. No problem at all. So it just depends. The most important thing when you're thinking about planting is to put the right plant in the right place. If you watch any of my other workshops, you'll hear me say that a lot. Right plant in the right place. Basically, you want to match your plants to the soil and site conditions. That is the key towards having a green thumb. Most people who have trouble growing plants, when they tell me, oh, I can't keep anything alive, I ask them, when you get a new plant, do you do a little bit of research online, finding out what the plant likes, where it wants to grow, how to take care of it? Most of the time, those people say no. Most of the people who do well with plants do that little bit of research and then act on what they learn. And putting the plant in the right place is absolutely crucial, or selecting the right plant for the place you have is a better way to put it. And so here are the most important factors. Sun and shade. Plants that want full sun in Southern California, technically in all places, that's 6 or more hours of direct sunlight throughout most of the year. So full sun doesn't necessarily need full blasting sun all day. Can be sun morning through noon and then some afternoon shade, or the opposite. You're thinking 6 or more hours of direct sunlight most of the year. If it says part shade, in inland Southern California, where we are, generally needs part shade. It'll fry in full sun. And certainly for full shade plants, they really, really don't want any direct sunlight in the summer. So that's sun and shade. Drainage and soil type. What that basically comes down to is a lot of our Waterwise plants want what's called, quote, good drainage, which means when the soil gets soaked with water, it doesn't stay wet for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that's most important once the soil is already wet and then it's raining, to make sure that it doesn't stay waterlogged for that long. And soil type, that means like sand or silt or clay. That can get kind of complicated, but ultimately at the end of the day, you don't need to worry about that much for choosing plants. It's basically, if your soil drains well, you can plant as long as you're meeting your sun and shade requirements, the size requirement of the space. You can plant pretty much the plants that want well-drained soil, most Waterwise plants. If your soil doesn't drain well, there's still plenty of great plants to choose from. Don't worry about it. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to plant plants that come from lists of plants that are adapted to clay soil. Even if your soil isn't technically clay, if it doesn't drain well because it's kind of compact or something, the results are going to be the same. So the advice is the same. If your soil doesn't drain well, plants that are adapted to clay soil is going to be the way to go. You will never change your soil type. If you live in Chino Hills and have heavy clay soil, you're not going to add a whole bunch of sand and all of a sudden have beautiful soil. More often than not, you're just kind of mixing up concrete. Accept the soil type that you have generally. If you have heavy clay soil, you can put on the top a little bit of compost, or definitely wood chip mulch over a number of years can help loosen things up. But in the amount of time with which you're going to take out your lawn and put in a garden, just accept the soil type you have. And there are a few other tips or tricks to help you out that we have in our other workshops. I will mention in a moment, but accept what you have and plant to those site conditions. If you're wondering what does well-drained soil mean, basically you can do some quick and easy drainage tests in your yard. You basically dig out in a few areas holes about 1 foot wide and 1 foot deep, fill it with water a couple of times and just let that water drain out. Make sure everything around that hole is very, very wet. And then like the third time, fill it up with water and time it. And you want to get the average as that hole drains, figure out the average of the number of inches per hour it drains by coming back every hour, measuring how many more inches the water drained down from the last measurement, and figuring it out. If over the course of that whole hole draining, you need to average it out because sometimes the first couple inches drain faster and then it slows down a bit. If you average out to 2 inches per hour of drainage or more, you have well-drained soil. You can plant anything that wants well-drained soil. In a lot of our area, we have that, and it's like you'll come out after an hour and the thing will be like halfway drained. And then after another hour, it's all the way, and you know you have great drainage. But not always. You might only have like a half an inch or 3/4 of an inch per hour. Then you have that heavier soil. So we don't have time to really get into it more step by step in this workshop. However, we have more detailed instructions in another workshop. You can see on the lower left on our choosing, purchasing, and planting Waterwise and California native plants workshop recording. We go step by step with pictures through drainage. and also other great stuff about how to choose good plants for your yard and high quality plants at the nursery. If you're just interested in the drainage test, you can see it here. That starts at about 12 minutes in. And then the last one, size. Don't put a plant that wants to be 12 feet wide in a space that's only 5 feet wide, especially if it's near a sidewalk or a path. You'll have to hack it back all the time. It won't do well. So look up the sizes your plants are going to get and anticipate that. Space those plants that wide. If it looks just too bare, you can put in a couple other plants, but be ready to rip them out. I don't encourage that, because what happens is at 6 months, all the extra plants people put in look great. And then at 2 years, things are starting to grow way on top of each other, and people don't notice till 3 years. And then all the plants are kind of all mixed in and overgrown. If anything, you could put your plants in, and in the fall, you could sprinkle out a few like native wildflower seeds, maybe some California poppies that are just annual plants. It's cheap to buy a few packets of seed. It can provide some color in the meantime through the spring season, and then it's not a big sacrifice to pull them out when you need to. And so we have resources to help with plant choices. Here's a few of them. Our first resource, which we're going to look at in just a second, is a website that we put out just to help you with your plant choices. It's called the Inland Valley Garden Planner. For those of you in Southern California, I also have a favorite plants for Inland Valley Gardens online workshop at our YouTube page. That's focused on Inland Valley areas like Inland Empire through San Gabriel and San Fernando valleys. All that applies perfectly. In less inland areas, all of these plants will grow well, but sometimes you can just get away with a little bit less water or a little bit more sun for the part shade ones. There's just certain plants that grow easily on the coast that we didn't include as favorite plants here because they can't quite stand up to the heat. But I would highly encourage you to check that out. And then for those of you within our local area, we also have a one-on-one residential landscape design assistance program, which I will talk about in just a second. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the Inland Valley Garden Planner. Move my calendar out of the way. And so this is the Inland Valley Garden Planner website, inlandvalleygardenplanner.org. If this whole thing about selecting plants is seeming overwhelming for you, you can go directly to the section we have called Garden Styles. And here we have 16 pre-selected groups of plants where the plants will all look good together and grow well together around a different theme. So for example, if you like the idea of a butterfly and songbird attracting landscape, you can click on that one. You can see some pictures of the plants, but more than that, you get a description of what that landscape is going to be like, and a plant list that we intentionally have kept pretty simple. 1 or 2 trees to choose from, some shrubs of different sizes. Some want full sun, some can take some shade, some perennial plants, and then in this one, for example, 1 ornamental grass. A little bit about other information, watering schedule for once the plants are established, and all of these plants are pre-selected to grow really well together. And then on any of these, you can click more to get a whole description of that plant, the size it's going to get, water needs information, the main properties, which gives you the sun, the soil, and then all of these, you're going to need to know how to maintain them. So these plants are low maintenance, but they're not no maintenance. Certainly less maintenance than mowing a lawn. The vast majority of them need a little bit of care once, maybe twice a year. Most of them, it's once a year, a bit of a cutback. But it's really important when you do that cleanup to know, do you do it in the spring or the fall? Normally, you're going to do it right before it's going to grow. So if you do it the wrong time of year, then it might just not do anything and look cut back for way longer than you want it to. And then some of them you just trim very lightly. Some of them you cut back harder to keep them looking their best. So that's why we have this. It's simple, but it's important to know what to do for what plant based on their preferences. And the reality too is if you have a gardener who's going to be taking care of it, there's a lot of great gardeners out there, but they don't have the experience with these kinds of plants yet. So sometimes you're going to need to share this information with them and sort of let them know, okay, don't touch this plant until this time of year. And then when you get to that time of year, ask them to do the specific thing. That's just kind of where the industry is at right now. for a lot of these plants. And it'll become more and more common for people to have experience with them as these plants continue to show up more and more often. And so that's if you go to the garden styles. There's some other helpful lists, like, for example, lists of plants that are good in pots, good for small spaces, slopes. But the real heart of this is what we call the plant finder, which is a searchable database where you can say, I know that I want a shrub that's going to be California native, and it's going to be low water, and it's going to be in full sun, and I want it to have colorful flowers and also be good for butterflies. I want butterflies too. And so now you've gone from the slightly over 350 plant profiles we have on this website, which are most of the plants that you might be able to find for a Waterwise garden in Southern California, have a chance at a local nursery of finding them. And that's down to 16 that meet all those criteria. So it's becoming a little bit easier to select. And then from there, you can look at just pictures, but then also go into the profiles and check it out. And then in those shrubs, some are going to be bigger shrubs, maybe too big for the space. Some will be smaller shrubs. You'll find what's just right for you. These plants are generally not things that you can just go to Home Depot and find occasionally these days. But I always encourage you to go to kind of a knowledgeable local nursery that knows how to take care of the plants. And for anyone either in the Inland Empire or through into the Los Angeles area, that landscape suppliers list that we have at the cbwcd.org/presentations page that I put into the chat has the nurseries that are in kind of the inland areas of Southern California, through a little bit more coastal, not right along the coast, that are specializing in these sorts of plants. If any of you see that list and have other nurseries to add on, please let me know. But those are going to be the sort of places where you can call around. And for those of you very close to us, kind of on that western edge of San Bernardino County, we have a couple of really great local nurseries where you can find this stuff. But reality is you'll need to go to 2 or 3 nurseries probably to find all the plants you want. And occasionally you might need to wait till later in the season, get most of your garden planted, and then have a few last plants you need to wait till they become available. That's pretty typical, and that won't get in the way of you getting your rebate. So with that, let's get back to the presentation. And I'm going to mention just a little bit about our landscape design assistance program, which is available to water customers of Chino Hills, Cucamonga Valley Water District, Monte Vista Water District, Ontario, Fontana, and Upland. And we will actually help you one-on-one create a custom landscape design for either a front yard or a backyard. If you finish one yard and then you want to do the other one, we are happy to help you with that as well. Just due to program demand, we can't do both at once. You start by picking one of these garden styles as a theme to start with. We always end up adding in additional plants as appropriate, but it gives us a starting point, and we can help you with that selection if you want. The program is no cost. It does require a $100 refundable deposit. That check gets cashed, but then if you finish a Waterwise garden project in that space within a year of participating in the program, you get a full $100 refund back. It's really just kind of a placeholder, making sure that people are serious about taking on their garden projects. And once you apply for that program, we will get in touch with you. We will ask you for measurements of your landscape. We'll kind of walk you through what we need. You'll send us photos of your site, and then we will prepare a base map, which is scaled up and everything. And then we'll have an online screen sharing meeting over Zoom, and we will literally come up with a planting design of your yard, which can include some basic stuff like rainwater harvesting. So this is an example of a mostly California native front yard that we did for a couple in Chino Hills. And it includes things like that permeable decomposed granite patio, rainwater harvesting, dry stream bed, and collection of butterfly and bird-friendly native plants with some succulents. So this is kind of the example. So we don't do extensive designing pergolas or patios or things, but we can put the footprint of it in, and really focused on kind of the getting over the hump with that plant selection, layout, and design. There are more details. I encourage you, if you're interested in one of those areas with those water providers, to get the full details at cbwcd.org/design assistance. So with that, couple of questions that came in from Mark. Is fire control important? Fire control is definitely important. I'm not sure what you mean by control, but I'll give it a guess. I'm assuming that you are wondering about like wildfire and are these plants appropriate for it? How do you plan for that? And that is very important. Depends on where you live. If you live in the urban wildland interface, and hopefully you know if you do, where from natural areas or from wild areas getting wildfire coming onto your property, that definitely would impact how you would design your yard. In best practices, you'd be using like gravel or decomposed granite mulch, not wood chips. And there are some plants that are bad for wildfire and some plants that are really helpful in preventing wildfire. There's also there's a whole firescaping is the term. I'd encourage you to research it. In addition to plant choice, depending on the size of your property, there are different kind of control zones where you might do different things in your landscapes, have more watered plants nearer. And then as you get farther out, maybe you're working with native plants, but you're pruning them up off the ground and you have them a little bit more spaced out than you might otherwise. So there are all sorts of things to think about where, for example, where I am in the middle of Pomona, not something I really need to be too concerned about in my particular yard, but certainly if I'm helping people in the design program and they are in one of those communities, we take that all into account. So from Anonymous, regarding soil, I have logs from felled trees last year. Can I just bury them about a foot or two deep to capture moisture around now and plant natives over that in the fall? Good question. Some people are talking about doing things like that these days. I generally don't prefer that technique. Certainly, like if you have a depressed area and you want to stack some up in there, like that's okay. Those logs are great for actually wildlife habitat because little beetles and stuff will go into those logs and that will bring birds that will eat them and kind of all sorts of stuff, as long as you're not in a potential wildfire area. So if you're in that urban wildland interface, you don't want to have that stuff around. And if you want to go through the effort of burying it to get that organic matter in the soil, you can. But like for where I am, I had a lot of logs on my property from tree work when we moved in, and we used those more as like landscape edging or little habitat features. We used some of them kind of doing little bits of like retaining on our hillside. But the breakdown of that organic matter in the soil, while over time it releases organic matter, it actually locks up nutrients temporarily that can make it hard for plants to get established. And native plants don't necessarily want that huge amount of organic matter. So I kind of keep it simple, use the logs creatively in kind of landscaping projects, but I don't focus on burying them and doing that. Certainly with the landscape rebate, I don't believe that would qualify. So hopefully that helps. If you have more questions, I'd be happy to kind of answer them at the end of the presentation when we can kind of do more one-on-one. From Wendy, no design help in Redlands. Not that I know of, Wendy. This is a pretty unique program, and it's only offered in that area because the properties in these areas are literally the properties that provide the direct funding for our staff. And so we are limited in being able to provide this kind of staff-intensive program for our one-on-one services for this local area. I do not know. You can get in touch with the local water agency, but to my knowledge, I don't believe that there's a similar program out in Redlands. Okay, so next we're going to talk about construction planning and costs and budgeting just a little bit. The most important thing is to make sure you consider it. A lot of people kind of jump into the project all excited about it, don't really think about the planning phase. And this is not just like the design of what plants you'll put in, but how are you going to get it built? Are you going to do it yourself? Are you going to hire a contractor? Are you going to be able to do it all at once? Is it going to need to be in phases or a bit at a time when you find the time, which is just fine. That's how I do all my projects myself. And then the phases might be because of time. It might be because of cost. If you can, plan to plant in the best season. Mid to late fall is the best time to plant. Think Thanksgiving through New Year. That's the sweet spot in Southern California. Even for these heat and drought tolerant water-wise plants, nothing wants to go from its little nursery pot where it's been growing, getting water every day in the nursery, into the ground in July, August, early September, and even June sometimes can be 110 degrees. Or also the problem with June, even if it's a nice June, is it's only a few weeks away from July when it will be hot. So for most of you, if you have a lawn now and you're thinking about this, a real logical project schedule is going to be summer is the best time for contemplating design, killing turf when it's actively growing in the summer. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, and preparing your irrigation system. And then fall, right when it's cooling off, get your plants in the ground. Around Thanksgiving is perfect because it's still warm enough to kind of have some growth. But even if you put it in after that, you don't see a lot of growth on the top. Plants are rooting in. And then when it comes around to the next spring, they're going to be ready to go with a good root system, and they can grow on the top and start to bloom beautifully. Sometimes that schedule is not always possible, but if you can, set yourself up for that. At this point, it's getting really tough to do a good job removing turf if you haven't thought out your turf removal, your design, especially if you're doing it yourself, all your own labor. Probably best to stick to this schedule. Work with your budget and adjust your design and your phasing as necessary. And if you're working with a contractor, bring them in early. Really good contractors usually can't start the next week because they're already on a job and they probably already have one or two lined up. And so by bringing in a contractor early, you can get on their schedule, ideally at a good time of year for the planting to happen. Also, if you're going to be working with a contractor, you always want to get at least 3 quotes. When you're getting your quotes or your bids, ask them to be written out in as much detail as possible. Let them know that you're talking to multiple people and you want to make sure that you're going to be able to compare what you're getting. Their assumptions are not always the same. Ask them what process they're going to be using to remove your turf. If they're doing turf removal, again, might not be the same. Don't be intimidated to ask questions. Make sure you understand. And when you get the quotes, if you have questions, reach out and ask them as well. When you get your 3 quotes, you might see a wide range. It happens a lot in the landscape industry because there's so many different assumptions. There's so many different products that can be used. There's so many different types of procedures, for example, for taking out lawns that a contractor might choose to use. And then in addition to that, some landscape contractors will do a really good job itemizing everything, figuring out all the costs. Some will look at the neighborhood, look at the car in the driveway, and just take a random guess as to what they think they might be able to get out of you. And that's not to knock the industry. It happens across all industries. In addition to that, if you are in California contractor law is that for projects over $500 total of installation costs for both materials and labor, anything over $500 should be done by a licensed contractor. By hiring a licensed contractor, you're also protecting yourself if there's an injury on the site or something like that. Licensed contractor is required to keep their license to have all the insurances and things like that. Now, just because someone's a licensed contractor doesn't mean they're going to do a great job. Also doesn't mean that they're terrible. So once you are thinking maybe you are going to work with a specific contractor, I also highly encourage you to ask them for references of similar sized projects that they've done in the last couple of years. So for example, if they're doing your whole front yard, you don't want to just get references of people where they've done like a couple of flower beds. You want to really know that they're qualified to do a whole yard, and then call those references. They should be able to provide them for you, and really make sure that you're going to be working with someone who's going to set you up with something that you're going to love long-term. You're going to be seeing it every day. And it's going to be an investment, whether it's of time, money, both. So really working with the right person, I can't stress it enough. Really important decision to make, because it can make something be a really great process, or on the flip side, we definitely have gotten calls with people wanting to know what we think they should do next because they just hired someone with a truck who, convinced them that they're the right person and they had a good price. And it's been 3 weeks since they've heard from them and the job is halfway done. And, those horror stories as well. So find a good person and then you'll have a good process. In our area in inland Southern California, here's what we've been seeing lately for the local turf removal and landscape installation costs for some of the people who have been taking on these projects and we've helped with design. And there are so many different things that can go into it, from site access, front yard, backyard, slope, narrow side steps in terms of the labor. A lot of the cost is the labor. If you're doing a landscape project, often the irrigation component will cost more than the actual plant. So depending on, even if your irrigation system needs to change from a lawn system to a drip system, if you have a pretty good lawn system in place, or it's at least in decent shape, then a lot of that underground piping can still be used. Not a lot of trenching would be necessary, versus if you need to redig and trench all that new stuff, that's a lot of labor. So these are very general costs of roughly what we've been seeing. And then you have to ask questions. But oftentimes people have no baseline to start with. So what we are seeing locally is for do-it-yourself projects, if you're doing the turf removal, planting, irrigation, mulching, you can often do that within that $3 per square foot budget, especially if you have an eye to do that. If you get into building patios and big pergolas and things like that, that's different. But talking about these can be very lovely. I mean, you don't need to do anything else. When I did my front yard project, this is all I needed, and didn't cut any costs or anything, but not being extravagant with huge kind of structures or things like that. For contractors, if you're looking at removal, installation of plants, adapting an existing lawn irrigation system to either a high efficiency spray system for the new landscape or a drip system, mulch, and then like a modest water capture, a small dry stream bed to meet the rebate requirements, what we've been seeing is somewhere between $3 and $9 per square foot. Talked to a couple of people who have found someone who would do it for them for $3 a square foot. Sometimes it's the person who is like already their landscaper. Wouldn't assume that you're going to find that. But I am mentioning it because I have worked with some people that did find that. And then up to around $9 a square foot. That might be a little bit more viable an assumption. If you're going to be taking on like something that includes all of that, maybe demolishing the concrete pathway that goes from the sidewalk to the steps of the house, putting in something like permeable, flagstone paths, some boulders, maybe some landscape lighting, that might get up to around the $12 per square foot range. And then, just depending on access or what's going in, it could go up from there. That's also assuming that all the plants are planted small, mostly, if not completely, 1 gallon plants. And that's all you need. These plants go pretty quickly. You don't need to put in huge plants or box trees or anything like that. Don't recommend it. Those plants are usually less healthy in the long run and grow slower. So depends on many factors, but you can see this range. That's why it's so important to get multiple quotes. If any of you then go on and do the project and are willing to share your cost information with me, will allow me to really help people, give them better guidance on budgeting. So please get in touch and let me know, or any other aspects of your experience. So let's see, have one more questions. Okay, so more stuff about the design. No, unfortunately, we can't help with the designs for people who live outside the area. In San Diego, you're going to probably want to look at local landscape designers, but also just looking for some general help with design, maybe local plant lists or some examples. A lot of different areas, and I think there's one down in San Diego. There's different chapters of the California Native Plant Society. If you are interested in working with California native plants, which I encourage you to at least look into, sometimes the local native plant societies have guides that they've put out that include aspects of design, kind of best plants. Sometimes the web pages have pictures of gardens, and there's very knowledgeable people who might be willing to give you advice, or often the garden designers locally who are involved in this sort of landscaping might be members, so you might be able to find them. That's another way to go. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about bringing it together in an example of a design. Then we will talk about turf removal and irrigation, and then kind of wrap it all up. So bringing it together in a design. This is going to be the process that I used to design the front yard of the place my partner and I live in Pomona. And so this is from Google Maps, basically the aerial of what we started with. And so you basically want to start with a base plan. And depending on how you like to approach things, if you wanted to, you can just take a screenshot from Google Maps and then start making notes. And sometimes people use Microsoft PowerPoint just to make some shapes and arrows and text. Sometimes people will use something like Adobe Photoshop if they have that. Or you can, what I normally do just to get started is I'll draw out a base plan. So I will look at this, or if you want to, you can print it off and then just trace the basic shapes. But sometimes I'll even just like look at this and then I'll just draw out the basic shapes on a piece of paper. Here I did it on like a tablet just because I wanted to be able to present it in bright colors, but it could just be like a piece of printer paper. Usually I'm looking at it. The first one, just the shapes make no sense. They're not accurate at all. I'm not trying to get it to scale, but by the third one, I have something that's workable and I put on it my goals. Realistically, the goals might be on a sheet nearby, but it's kind of nice to have it right there on the plan so you can't kind of bury the goal sheet, kind of forget about it. You always want to go back to your goals. And then you put just the kind of major features. So the goals here for our front yard were something that would be beautiful to see right there in the front yard, coming from the house to the driveway, going back for the neighbors to see, something that would provide habitat for birds, butterflies, and pollinators, something that would be low water, something that would increase the privacy a little bit for the front yard without like just putting up a huge hedge or a huge fence or something like that. That really turns our back on the neighborhood. We are on a cul-de-sac and the front yards aren't tiny, but they're not huge. And so, for example, from any of the windows, like from our living room or from here where I'm sitting, from the living room or here where I'm sitting right now, it kind of feels like four houses are looking directly at you because of the angle. So we wanted to break that up a little bit with plant material. Wanted to have something that smells really nice. A lot of the California native plants just have those incredible, incredible smells. And in the summer or in the rain, they'll just kind of hang in the air, even come into the house some. And we also happen to have, because we face north, some nice views out of some of the windows of the San Gabriel Mountains. And so we wanted to keep those mountain views, kind of find the right balance as we provide some privacy. And so again, goals are very important to have close at hand, because when I'm starting to think about planting trees and heights and things like that, I want to remember all of these goals, even as I'm starting to get into the minutia of what plant to put where. Important things: driveway, walkway. Here we had discovered doing some plumbing work right when we were moving in that when the water main line was replaced at some point in the past, it was buried only about 6 inches deep. So for us, that was important to get onto the plan, because if I'm going to be doing a dry stream bed or digging out something there, I need to make sure I'm going to keep the water main line buried. Main planting area, the neighbor side, driveway, gravel strip. That's kind of important for the view, because sitting here looking out, a decent part of the view is actually the neighbor's car in the driveway and their gravel strips. So thinking about maybe providing more plants in that view, working with the plant heights. I always like to note doors and windows, because especially for front yards, but also for backyards, we spend also a lot of time inside the house getting glimpses out into our yard rather than just only being out in the yard. So knowing where the windows are for our plant design is important as well. And then also having them, so if we want some stuff closer to the house that's taller but not blocking the windows, we know where to put those. And then the last thing is I do like to also put the basic ridges of the house, because when I later put where the water is coming off the roof, that helps kind of inform that. And so that's the base plan. It's not a piece of art, not rocket science, just getting down those most important features. From there, you go into what's called site analysis, which is just a fancy way of saying putting down your observations about the site, which is going to then impact what you decide to put where in your design. So observe for as long as it takes. And a lot of this goes back into those right plant, right place things, the sunny and the shady areas. Or, for example, are there areas where you have like the north side of the house or the garage where it's going to be shady a good part of the year and then full blasting sun in the summer? Dappled shade from trees, just getting that down, what's going on where. Soil and drainage, we talked about the soil test. So usually on the average residential yard, it's going to be pretty similar across the whole yard, but sometimes there's pockets where for whatever reason, it's worse or better in different areas. Views, those might be views out of your property, like at the mountains, or views that you want to block onto your property, like your neighbor, there's a chain link fence and your neighbor, when they're in the backyard, can totally see you hanging out in your hot tub. So maybe you need a hedge there, those sorts of things. Water flows, similar to what we talked about with that water capture. Where does the water flow? Now you can get it onto this piece of paper with some arrows and really make sure that your design is lining up in the right place to capture that water. Microclimates, those are any particularly hot or particularly cold areas that are going to impact what you do. For example, in inland Southern California, we have extra hot microclimates that make areas in our yard, lots of it is just going to be hot in the summer. But for example, if you have a strip of your landscape that's alongside an asphalt driveway that gets full hot afternoon western sun, and maybe the other side of it is a stucco wall and it's just this narrow planting area in between. I have that. That area is extra, extra hot. And so whatever I put there needs to really take that extra heat. Maybe a good place for some flowering desert shrubs that'll take all that heat and just turn it into more flowers in the summer. Are there noise or other neighbor issues that you want to deal with? Or existing plants, including either seasonal weeds. Sometimes people will have an area that they know is just really bad. Maybe they need to do something else, or even just wait in one corner of the yard another season and just focus on taking care of the weeds. Or established trees, for example. So sometimes people will have a medium water, not low water, but medium water tree, like maybe a magnolia, that also happens to be 50 years old and beautiful. Well, that's something that's going to impact your design. You are going to want to maybe work with drip irrigation so you can have a zone that waters that tree, extends a ways beyond the canopy, making sure you're still watering the roots of that tree really well. That's going to stay medium water use. And then maybe the rest of the yard finds that right aesthetic balance where the rest of the yard could be lower water. There are definitely ways to do that, but you're going to want to mark any existing plants that you want to keep. Make sure you get them on your plan. And so the site analysis, again, logical, doesn't need to be rocket science. For us, water was a big thing. The water, like I already mentioned, would flood, would come down the slope and kind of flood here and flood along here. And water was coming off the roof this way and off the roof this way, as well as down the slope that was just lawn, and some down the driveway, and then eventually would flood into this area as well. Here's our mountain view. That just putting it here to remind me, this area felt too open. This area, because north is up here, would be seasonally shaded from the house, but then in summer, full blasting sun. And those are the main things that were going to affect the planting. But all of these definitely needed to be taken into account. So getting them down on the site analysis. If you are working on a base map that you draw out, as soon as you have your base map at this stage, scan it, take pictures of it, photocopy it, and then leave that aside, because you want to be able to do multiple versions of your site analysis or make mistakes or whatever, not have to redraw your base map if you're drawing it out. If you are doing it on like a digital file, then same thing, like save just the empty file, just the image separately, and then you can do different layers or different save as for your files as you go. So you don't need to start over or spend a bunch of time undoing things. From here, we start to feel out our design. So we don't jump from that site analysis to a complete planting plan, but we start to kind of feel out maybe how it's going to come together. So in this case, you see that we decided we wanted a small multi-trunk deciduous tree here on the corner in the most open area, and it could have its leaves and lose them, we decided, because we didn't want something super dense right at the sidewalk. Even when it lost its leaves, just the branches would still provide a bit of a sense of privacy. However, here, right outside, our couch is here, our coffee table is here, looks out, feels way too open. We did want a small evergreen tree that did sort of provide some privacy to our living room area. So we can have our window open, see over these small trees to the San Gabriel Mountains, to see Mount Baldy, and still have a little bit of privacy from the small trees. So not crazy huge trees, but a couple of small trees, 15, 20 feet tall maximum. From this side, we wanted to get that little bit more privacy from doing an informal hedge of native plants. That would be great for bird habitat, because if we didn't have this hedge here, we'd just be looking at the cars in the neighbor's driveway. It wasn't a view that we needed to maintain. However, even on the corner, we curved it back some and still left an area here. All of these Cs are for pops of colorful perennial plants, so smaller plants that will have some seasonal color interest. So again, it's not like we're turning our back on the neighborhood, and even coming up the driveway for the mailman or just when we're driving up or have guests, some of those pops of color. And then recognizing that our social space is never going to be in the front yard. Get relatively small front yard, not tiny, but we have about 1,200 feet total in the front yard and then a big backyard. So we're always going to use the backyard as our social space. And so we see our front yard kind of driving up and walking, but we mostly see our front yard from the windows of the house looking out. And so we decided to kind of build up the landscape with lower plants closer to the house for the most part. And then we'd have a kind of meadowy area with a bird bath sited so it can be seen from 2 different windows. And then we'd have some medium-sized shrubs and then our tallest layer in the back. And from whatever the main view is going to be, building up those layers like that is a way to also kind of get the sense of more depth, even in a relatively narrow space. And so we decided that that primary view for this planting would be from the windows. And then in some areas, we also could have some kind of shrubbier material. For example, like the one outside of this room, the size, again, this is just a rough drawing, doesn't match the window perfectly, but essentially it's a taller shrub on one side of the window where just a few branches kind of come in. They kind of break that plane of looking out, kind of feels very nice and natural, but it doesn't block the whole window. So starting to kind of think through that feel before we choose individual plants. And then we start to just kind of make lists of those plants. So those trees, we actually did decide here. The species of the plants, we decided doing that research, using those resources, and then kind of the lists of the plants that would go into each zone. And you can see it's starting to change here too as well, where we thought that there was going to be room for 3 shrubs, and then starting to realize there's actually room for quite a bit more, maybe mixing in some shrubs and ornamental grasses. If you are going to then take the next step to drawing it all out on graph paper, which I would encourage you to do if you think you're up for it, then a great resource that kind of breaks down kind of how to do that is this one that was put out for free by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power called Lawn Be Gone. It was created by a group that has made these guides for a number of water agencies. And I created, just because the link of where to find it is very long, I created a quick free redirect. That's cbwcd.org/G3book. cbwcd.org/G3book. And that kind of walks you through site plan, drawing it out to scale on graph paper, where each square meets or equals a certain number of feet. And then thinking about how to draw your rainwater capture on there. And then finally put your plants on there. So you can look up the size of your plants, kind of draw them all out, and really figure out your design and know exactly how many plants you need to order. If you are going to do that, the only thing that I would mention is that for here in the guide, they mention using 1 square, which on most graph paper is 1/4 of an inch to be 1 foot. And that might work in LA where the lots are kind of smaller, but in most suburban areas, what we find is I'd encourage you to use 11 by 17 size graph paper, which you can sometimes find at a local art supply store, easy to order online. And then for most of the time, to fit either a full front yard or full backyard, unless it's quite small, on a single page, 1/8 of an inch should equal 1 foot. So each square will be 2 feet by 2 feet. Or sometimes you can order graph paper where they have smaller squares, and they actually can have 1/8 inch squares if you want to special order that. And then you can also just tile multiple pieces of graph paper if you want that larger size. So that is just one note for that. Now, some people aren't going to draw out the measurements and do that. You're just not going to do it. And if not, that's okay. If you're not going to do that, I would encourage you to spend a lot of time on your site, walking around, taking measurements, estimating, using like little flags. Sometimes people who won't do that will pick up some of those little sprinkler flags, which are almost just like a stiff wire and then a little piece of plastic flags of different color. You can write on those with a Sharpie the names of your plants, kind of measure out where they would go, kind of do something to anticipate it. But for most people, although it takes some time, it really will protect you in making sure that you purchase the right numbers of plants and less trips to the nursery. You're not buying plants that you don't have room for by going through and drawing it out. And so this is just an example. I do this all the time, so I work quickly in computer programs. And so finally then, I did in fact create the 2-scale. I used the initial for the plants for each different plant and figured out my exact plant numbers. So that's about as much as we can cover in terms of design, but we do have a couple of classes that have much more great garden design information. The California Native Garden Design class covers a lot of turf and then spends more time on this example, really going into it more. And then the do-it-yourself landscape design class, which is more general, but also talks a lot more about setting your goals and different kind of features and landscapes and things like that. Both of those available on our YouTube page. So just to wrap this section up, now that we've looked at the design process for the front yard, I'll show you some pictures. So this is when we moved in. This is around when we were applying for the rebate, January. So you'll notice I didn't do all of this in the exact right time of the year because I was not going to be the water conservation person. Watering a lawn I didn't use, but I was also not going to be the person moving into this neighborhood and making the neighbors look at this for a whole another 3/4 of a year. And so we rushed, but for me, this early March planting date was the very end of the planting season. So we've already blown past that, which is why I'm encouraging you to think about planning out your project carefully, maybe planting in the fall at this point in time. And you can see we did have some annual grass weeds coming up. And so we're going to have to do something about this. So we planted. And at this stage, same thing. Doesn't look like much. Plants are tiny. Even our trees, we planted tiny. And most people would think, oh my God, should have planted way larger. And then we did our cardboard mulching process as our main way of dealing with the grass. So this is a huge pile of mulch because it is also for our large backyard. You wouldn't need this much for just the front yard, and lots of hoarded and scavenged cardboard boxes, which we basically laid out with a good overlap to be a biodegradable weed barrier, which will last 6 months to a year until the grass is smothered. And some grass will grow back, just pulling it out as it goes. And we'll talk more about this in just a moment when we talk about turf removal. And so at about 2 months, starting to get a few flowers, everything's still kind of tiny. 2.5 months, you can see we redid our irrigation system to be taller, high efficiency sprays that go over the plants and are much more efficient than a traditional lawn sprinkler system. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Got the gravel in for the French drain, starting to mix in some other sizes of rocks to make it a little more natural. And then August of that year, just had the screen open on a warm summer day and looked out and thought, oh my God, it's more green than brown. Things have started to grow in. Everything's still pretty small. You can't quite see the design intent yet, but it's a garden. So you can see here with the larger plants on the outside, still a little bit more mulch space, some more color starting to come in. California fuchsia, hummingbirds coming around, which they absolutely love it. We got the yard certified as a wildlife habitat, which is something you can do through the National Wildlife Federation. If you want, it's kind of cool. You get the sign to let the neighbors know kind of what's going on in the yard. And it's a self-certification thing with a small donation to them. It's like 20 something bucks. And it's basically if you are doing things to provide food, like the right plants, water, like bird bath or a small recirculating water feature, cover, so like some shrubbery, places to raise young, so a certain amount of density, like that hedge we had along the side that we planted, then you can get that. And really started seeing the beneficial life that we wanted to move in. So in August, I noticed every morning out the window, I would see this hummingbird sitting in this one spot and it would fly around. Hummingbirds, they drink nectar, but they also eat a lot of gnats and things like that for their protein and minerals. So would always come back to this one dried grass stalk on this ornamental California fescue. So it was really cool seeing the life that showed up. So you can see starting to grow in and get these moments of beauty in the morning, leaving on my way to work. Every garden, even if it's done by professionals, loses a couple of plants, even if it's planted in the right time of year. So don't beat up on yourself if you lose a few. It's opportunities to either try to replant the same thing or plant something else. You don't want to lose a lot. That's what all that research is for, but happens a little bit. So this is at about 6 months. We happen to have soil that these plants love, but these plants do get growing pretty quickly as long as you are watering them correctly, which for most of these is a good deep soak once a week in their first year in Southern California, then less after that. So things will get going. And then at about 13 months, happened to have another pile of mulch delivered for the backyard. So we got this nice kind of overhead perspective. And it's really started to grow in, starting to get lots of color. You can see our trees still have quite a bit of growing to do, but 13 months, and they were planted from tiny little 1-gallon plants that cost like $12. So pretty good. If you bought them this size, they'd be like $300 probably. And these are going to be healthier and continue to grow faster. And were a lot easier to plant. And so really starting to come along. And we like that kind of naturalistic look. That look may or may not be for you. And that's in some areas, it's kind of wild. And even in the front, some areas, it's a little bit more cottage garden-y like. And again, like I said, always changing throughout the year. So this is spring. And then from the same perspective, once the spring flowers fade, we get a whole kind of cascade of other flowers that come in the summer. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about turf removal. Just saw a couple of questions come in. What do I think of just slowly figuring it out over time? Each year, a couple more trees and big shrubs first. If that's what's going to work for you, and if that's what also works for your budget, may or may not be the budget. But yeah, if that's what feels right to you, then I would say go for it. Some people are feeling like they really want to take it all on and they're looking for a result quicker. And that's the average person who I work with. And so that's kind of why we present this, but definitely small incremental changes, just fine. And I've had yards in the past where maybe there's some existing trees and yeah, we'll do one area, then another area, then another area. Even in my yard now, it took us a couple of years and there's still areas that I'm working on in my yard, especially for, we prioritize figuring out a lot of plants, but I still have a patio to build. I still have whole other areas to build out in my yard, even though I spend lots of my time on this sort of stuff. So make it work for you. Yeah, it's useful to kind of think it all through, but there's no reason why you need to do it all at once. From Paul, our house faces south. In the summer, out backyard gets 100% sun, and in the winter, only about 20%. How do I know whether to pick full sun or partial sun plants? Good question. So the key for you for that is going to be, there are a number of plants that can take either full sun or part sun. And so the best ones for your situation in general are going to be those plants that can adapt to either. So they can take that summer sun, but they're not going to be like really kind of aching for it in the winter. And that's mostly that kind of north-facing zone of my front yard. The plants that we put there kind of all meet that criteria as well. Okay, so first you might need to get the lawn out. And so what we're going to do in our last like 17 minutes is crash course on turf removal and on irrigation. We have full additional workshops if you're actually going to take it on our YouTube page on both of these, and I will mention those. And so really it's just to get you thinking about what you should be thinking about. First, you might need to get the lawn out. And if you have lawn, you will soon learn that the funny thing about lawn is when you want it to be universally green and beautiful, it wants to have a bunch of brown patches. But once you decide you want it to finally up and completely die, enough of it will want to keep coming back once you plant your new plants that you really want to do a good job removing it at the outset, because it's a lot easier to do it when you're in the mode of wanting to remove it all. Once you have your plants there, if grass is trying to grow back through the roots of your new plants, you're trying to pull it out, it's difficult. First thing you need to do is figure out your type of turf and if you have any particular weeds you need to deal with. Turf falls into two broad types: cool season and warm season. Cool season turf usually is tall fescue around here, like Marathon is one of the popular brand names. It has the nice dark green, wide-ish kind of leaves or leaf blades, and it's green and growing all year long, even in the coolest parts of the winter. It's often the main thing that's put in if turf is renovated. However, and if you have all of that and it's really truly all tall fescue, that's good news because that's the one that most really doesn't want to live in Southern California. And if you turn the water off for a couple of months in the summer, it mostly will die. You can turn the water back on and check, and most of it will be gone. However, no matter what you started with, most of us have either mostly or a significant amount of warm season grass in it. Usually that's going to be weedy Bermuda grass. That's that kind of stringier, small grass that you can see on the right. And one way to know it is if you have an otherwise green lawn that maybe is that tall fescue, and then in the coldest parts of the winter, patches of it just here and there start to look like this, even if it's wet, even if there's plenty of water, then that's probably Bermuda grass. It spreads by seed. And also if there's a landscaper that's coming around, they will be mowing all the lawns, picking up seed of everything on their route. And that equipment just kind of brings it everywhere. So if you have that, it's also quite a bit harder to kill because it can go brown or tan in the coldest parts of winter. It goes dormant, but also with a lack of water. So if you turn the water off, it might look dead, but it might just be dormant. And as soon as the water comes back, even if it's just that once a week deep soak to establish your new lower water plants, that's going to be enough for it to grow patchy here and there and start growing all through your new shrubs and things. So you really, really need to do some work on that. Here's kind of how to identify it. And the thing about it, part of why it's hard to kill is because it can spread from seed, which is very distinct. It can spread from stolons, which are the stems that creep along the top of the surface and root down. And it can spread from rhizomes from its roots as well. You never want to try to rototill this stuff because it'll just break all of this up. And each little bit with a root can be its own individual plant. Another one to kind of be on the lookout for, and if you have it, you basically do your turf removal technique and then just pull it out whenever it comes back, is nutsedge. And that might blend in with the turf when it's first pulled out, but then you start to see this when it comes back. You never want to let it go all the way to seed. If you do, it kind of looks nice, actually. It's like a little papyrus, but it will kind of take over, and it can regrow from these little nuts. And that's why you want to pull it out when it's very young and just keep on it, and eventually you'll win. Also, as you reduce the water over time, you will eventually kind of create different conditions, which it doesn't like as much. So for the turf removal techniques, my go-to is something called sheet mulching. And that is basically, like I showed in my front yard, using recycled corrugated cardboard from wherever you can get it. Auto body shops, bicycle shops are great places to ask. In this example, the homeowner had a company that installed solar panel boxes. Perfect. Sometimes people will use smaller boxes. I worked with someone who helped her with her design. She worked at Starbucks, small boxes, but she had an unlimited quantity of them. So she used those. As long as you have a really nice overlap, it will help with the weeds. And so basically what you do is you're going to sometimes use this as your primary method of killing the turf, especially in a larger space where it just might not be that viable to remove the lawn. Here, because it was a small space and we were only doing one season, and then we did the other side of the path the next season, you can, if you have the labor, just kind of roughly get out as much of the grass as possible. But with this Bermuda grass, we knew it was going to grow back anyways because the roots are very deep and it can grow back from a little bit of a root. So we use the sheet mulching as well. Water very well, because when you put this down, you want to kind of lock in that moisture. Let it dry out for a couple of days so that it's not muddy on the top. And then you lay out your cardboard with a nice overlap, 6 to 9 inches. If you have a lot of Bermuda grass, 9 inches. You can see here that we did the path area first, put down the river rock, and then did the other areas. Then you water the cardboard to get it to kind of slump down and conform to the landscape. And then you put on your mulch layer, whether it's 2 or 3 inches of wood chip mulch, or in this case, we did pea gravel in the pathway. And there you go. In all of these techniques, no matter what you use, if there's Bermuda grass, a little of it's going to grow back and you just stay right on it. But this is my go-to because it's organic. It turns basically something that would otherwise hopefully be recycled, but often just ends up in a dumpster or even at the municipal level that might not get recycled, and turns it into a resource. Lasts for 6 to 9 to 12 months, depending on how much moisture is in the soil. And then it just completely breaks down and biodegrades. If you have a small area or also just like a very weedy area that's really not turf, you can use rolls of paper if you can't get the cardboard from the hardware store. In the paint section, you always want to use the brown stuff, never the red stuff. The red stuff has a waterproof layer in it. So if you're doing landscape, you want to use the brown paper. You can get it in a close to 3-foot roll. And I always do at least a couple of layers of it. It's not as effective as cardboard. It doesn't last as long. But for general weeds and then wood chip mulch on top, it works. The cost can add up surprisingly quickly for a large area, but just for a planter bed or two, it definitely does have a place. I much prefer that to this stuff. The black, sometimes it's tan, but the woven weed barriers, if they worked as advertised long-term, it would be one thing. Contractors love to use this because it's quick and easy and it looks nice when it's done. It does prevent the weeds from coming up or the grass from coming back for a while. However, what happens is that that's a bunch of plastic on the soil. And especially as wood chip mulch breaks down, then all of those pores where the water and air is supposed to get through start to clog up over time. And over time, once you're at year like 6, 7, 8, the plastic starts to break apart too. Then you're pulling out chunks of plastic from your landscape. There's weeds germinating on top of it. It just doesn't work long term. So if it did, that'd be great. But unfortunately, it's just not a good long-term solution. And then the contractor is long gone. Oftentimes, they don't even realize because they're just moving on from landscape to landscape. It's kind of a standard in a lot of landscapes, but it's not necessarily a good way to go. Method number 2 is solarization. That is using clear plastic that you can get at the hardware store in the summer to literally steam sterilize the top 4 or so inches of the soil, kills everything, including all the grass and plant roots. I wouldn't use it personally this close to shrubs because it would be negatively affecting the roots there. And it also needs to be in full sun. So it probably wouldn't work here under the canopy of the tree. But basically, you water really well ahead of time, and then you lay down this plastic layer very tightly. So you can hold it down with either the little staples that are used to like hold down drip irrigation, or you can see here 2x4s or rocks, but so that the wind can't kind of flap it around. You need to kind of contain that heat. It makes like a super greenhouse effect inside, where in the summer in full sun inland, it will make it hot enough to kill everything in the top few inches of soil. Now, Bermuda grass can be deep enough that some of it can come back. It's the same as everything else. If some of it comes back, pull it out. But it's a pretty good technique overall. Because it only works in full sun and because it fries roots, like if you have existing trees, you might need to do something like this. They probably did the cardboard mulch in this area underneath the tree, and then farther out are doing the solarization. And you can see here the exact product. It's clear plastic sheeting. Sometimes it's called visqueen. Needs to be clear. The black doesn't allow enough heat to penetrate through down into the soil. And it comes in thicknesses called mil. 4 mil or 6 mil are going to be the right thicknesses. 4 is about ideal. It lasts long enough at that thickness, but it allows a little bit more heat through than the 6 mil. This is going to be something you need to lay out for at least 8 weeks in the height of the summer to be effective. We're going into a good period, but I would still wait till probably like mid-June to start it, because if we get overcast days, it's not really going to work. Method number 3, just physically digging it up. Works best in small yards and, if there's like teenage kids at home with lots of energy. But I have seen people do it of all age ranges and physical abilities. across the street from my parents' house, there is an older retired woman who is probably in her late 60s, early 70s, and she just slowly chipped away on it over maybe the course of a year, started on the parkway, and just that was part of her exercise routine, just worked away at it a little bit at a time. And when you're doing this, you're generally trying to dig out a chunk at a time. If you're doing it with the shovel, shake off as much soil, and then you're green wasting just a bit at a time. If you're trying to do the whole thing at once, sometimes people will rent a sod cutter and literally cuts up the sod and you roll it up. It's a lot of weight. You need to rent a lowboy dumpster from your local waste people. Can end up costing quite a bit just for disposal fees, plus the rental for a 1,000 square foot lawn. It's probably going to be about $1,200. And because you're only taking out about 2 inches of soil, not that great for the Bermuda grass, pretty effective for the fescue, but I would definitely combine this with the sheet mulching for the Bermuda grass because there's still going to be lots of roots and the grass will be able to grow back decently. So not my favorite technique, honestly, with the sod cutter. And then finally, sometimes people do use herbicide, which I can not really honestly recommend. At the corporate lawyer level, they're still arguing about whether or not this stuff, Roundup or glyphosate, which is the active ingredient, is a carcinogen. But the manufacturer recently proposed to pay over $10 billion to resolve lawsuits because they're worried they're going to have to pay more. So that tells me something. I'm going to talk about it just a little bit because at the end of the day, some people still come to me and tell me that they're going to use it anyways. And if anybody goes into a landscape supply store or hardware store and says, I have Bermuda grass, this is what they're going to give you. The reality is that you can't spray it once and just be done. But even like the proper technique, if you do all the research about how to use it for Bermuda grass control, it's spraying, it's waiting 2 weeks, it's watering in between, so you know that it's not going dormant, it's spraying again. Normally it takes 4 applications at least, which is 8 weeks. Same timeline for any of the other organic techniques that we talked about. And some will still most likely come back that you'll have to pull over time. So make your own decision. But if you are going to use it, wear long sleeves. Don't spray when it's breezy. You don't want to breathe it in and you don't want it to blow onto your neighbor's roses. And beyond that, so all we really have time to cover. But if you are going to take this on, I highly encourage you to check out our Removing Your Lawn the Right Way workshop, where we go way deeper into the techniques of each of these. And you can just kind of click forward to the techniques you're interested in if you want to. So that's cbwcd.org/YouTube, Removing Your Lawn the Right Way. And then in our last few minutes, just a quick introduction to thinking about what you might need to do with your irrigation system. Realistically, if you are putting in a native landscape, especially in your backyard, you have one option of completely abandoning your irrigation system if you are willing to be highly involved with your garden and your landscape, because then you are the irrigation system. When things are young, you can have watering rings and water with a hose once a week. As things get older, like in parts of my backyard, we water maybe once a month in some of our native landscapes. I literally just have an oscillating fan sprinkler connected to a hose that I put up, but I really make sure I adjust it. I put out jars so I know exactly how much water is going out and I can turn it off at the right time. So I'm very involved with it, but that allows me to not have a permanent irrigation system in the back. With the layout of my front yard, I'd never be able to do that without just watering all over the sidewalk and the driveway and the neighbor's car and everything. So there I have a highly efficient, permanently built system. Each approach has advantages and disadvantages. There's no perfect way to do it. It's what's going to work best for your site and for the kind of homeowner and gardener that you are. But you're going to need to make changes from a turf irrigation system, because a typical lawn sprinkler system that pops up 2 inches or 4 inches is just going to shoot water directly into the closest plant next to it, which is taller than 2 inches or 4 inches. And that's going to get way too much water. Everything else that would be intended for it to hit would get not nearly enough water. So there's a couple of good options. You could retrofit your spray irrigation system so that the sprinklers are taller and are highly efficient rotating nozzles. You can install what's called a drip irrigation grid, and there's plenty of bad options. So these I consider to be bad options. This is the stuff that normally you'll get in the irrigation section of the big box hardware store. And there's the thicker irrigation line, and then it goes to the thinner one, and all these buttons and doodads. In most cases, you're asking for trouble. I'll mention a workshop where I get way more into it, but essentially, we have a program where we go to people's houses and advise them on their irrigation systems in our local area. And we have literally never once seen one of these systems that don't have pieces that have fallen apart, where some areas get way more water than they want, and other areas then get way less water. Again, it just doesn't work well. And then even in the best case situation, as these Waterwise plants grow in, their roots want to go far and wide and get a good even watering, and they just drip water at the base of the plant. It doesn't keep the plants happy and healthy long term, even though they're cheap and quick to put in. So it's just not an appropriate long-term system in most cases. Here are the approaches that we recommend. Retrofitting a spray system. Here we basically took mostly the locations of the sprinklers for the lawn. We just moved them, in this case, to put the trench drain in, shifted them in a little bit, which there's kind of some adapters and some pipe that is flexible, and you can use it to swing, get it in place, and then putting them on these solid risers with a highly efficient spray nozzle. And when you're doing that, if you need to kind of move them around or add one more, you can with this technique. And it works very well, as long as the plants on the edge of the landscape are low enough that these will always be able to shoot over them. And then in certain areas, you can have taller plants towards the middle. So it's not perfect, but also native plants don't need a perfectly even distribution, because their roots go far and wide and they can find that water where they need it, as long as nothing's shooting directly into the side. One quick note, if you're thinking about a spray system, is that really how they want to be set up, and most of them are, is that each spray nozzle, the water from it kind of hits the center of the head, goes all the way to the next spray nozzle. Not like underneath, where just the outer edges of the sprays hit. Occasionally we see this. This would be the time to set it up correctly, where there's proper overlap. And then you'd want to switch it to what's called a high efficiency rotating nozzle, where instead of a general mist, this new type of spray made by many manufacturers has individual streams that rotate around. So it gets much more of the water where it's intended to be, much less of it sprays off in the wind. And then finally, and it is 8:30 now, but we're just towards the end. It's hard to cram all of this information into just 2.5 hours, but all very important. So last couple of slides coming up is the other system. If you're going to go with a drip system that we recommend, is a drip grid system. So this uses this is about a 1/2 inch line, where the individual emitters are already inside the line. These are not just holes, these are actually emitters that are welded inside the line. And along that line, they all, with a proper pressure reducer and a filter, which is part of how you install the system, will drip the exact same amount of water. And you can see that coming out here, there's specific fittings, and it's a highly engineered little thing. It's not just a hole. And you lay them out so that there's kind of an even grid. So for a small area like this, where sprinklers would always overspray and waste water and cause damage to the asphalt over time, you always would go with something like drip these days. For a larger landscape, this is actually what you're talking about. Something this large, if the design accommodated it, I'd probably go with those high efficiency sprays, because this is a lot of drip line to lay out and maintain. But I have been involved with projects this large, and it works well in the right circumstances. And as the water spreads out underground, you base your spacing on the soil type you have, and basically it's full coverage. It's as if it had rained, but it's just not going through the sky. It's kind of just underneath your mulch layer. If you have pathways, you can obviously skip those pathways. And there are adapters depending on the size of your landscape, where you actually, instead of having to retrench and do more gluing PVC pipe, can often, especially in a residential situation, just start with unscrewing certain of the sprinklers and putting adapters on, and then capping off the rest. So you're making use of all of your underground piping. Depending on the size, sometimes you will need to do some more PVC pipe work. And that's basically all we can cover in terms of irrigation this evening, just to introduce you to the concepts, because it is this whole thing. But we have a whole workshop for that, which is our retrofitting turf irrigation systems for Waterwise and California native gardens. And you can get a recording of that on our YouTube page. And one of the things I do in that is essentially walk you through the irrigation system that I inherited with my front yard, some of the issues with that, and show you what I did to then move those sprinklers, show you the exact techniques we use, the products to move them, put them on those higher risers. And then if you were going to also instead put in drip irrigation, we look at two different approaches to how you would use those adapters and figure out what you would need to do for a drip irrigation system. We also have on the YouTube page some supplemental videos, for example, where you literally can see us on video step by step, like putting together the drip irrigation zone, or literally can see that process of how I changed the riser part on the sprinkler in order to have that higher sprinkler nozzle that shoots over with the spray system. And so we'll finish it up just with wrapping up one of the last things that I get asked at the end of this workshop. So I included this slide, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and a quick, just 4-question closing poll. But I want to wrap up with the order of things, because after hearing all this information, some people are thinking, okay, I got a lot of that, but what order do I take this on in? So remember, you're going to start with your goals, your site observations, thinking about your budget, and with all of that, preparing your design. If you're going to be working with the contractor, you'll then talk to multiple contractors, get those quotes, check those references. In that time, you're also thinking about that turf replacement rebate application. If you're going to be doing that, turn that in, get your approval before you start doing any work on the landscape. Then you'll kill your turf, prepare the site. If you have to dig your dry stream bed, move the soil, any of that sort of stuff, do all of that. The killing the turf is best done in the summer for that warm season Bermuda grass that a lot of us will have. Then you're going to do your primary irrigation system work. Do you need to work on valves, run pipes, anything like that? Or even if you're just working with adapters, get as much of that done as possible. Maybe you're going to get all of your irrigation system work done, but sometimes for people working with that drip grid tube, they'll do everything, all of the pipe and everything, but then run that actual brown tube right after planting, like literally the next day, because sometimes it's easier to work around the plants rather than to plant and have all that tubing in the way. Then you're going to do your planting, best done late fall to early winter, definitely by the end of March if at all possible, because sometimes we do have those heat waves starting April, May. And then it's going to be great for the grow-in as well. You really want the plants to be able to establish. Ideally, fall through early winter. Final irrigation system work, if you need to run those last parts of the drip lines, turn all your irrigation on, make sure everything's working. And then you do your cleanup, your mulching, your final touches, a little bit of last rocks or anything like that. And then you move into establishment care and enjoy watching your garden grow in. And we have workshops to help you on all of that. Again, on the YouTube page, we have an installation and establishment for California native and Waterwise landscapes. And then we have that choosing, selecting, and planting Waterwise and native plants. And we also have a landscape maintenance basics kind of introduction, going over basic pruning techniques and everything you would need to know to then sort of make sense of all of that information on the Inland Valley Garden Planner. So with that, we will conclude there. What I'm going to do is launch just a brief closing poll, just a few questions, and then I will have time to answer any questions in the Q&A. This is a lot of information to try to cram into one workshop. So please, in addition to filling out the poll, I would love to hear in the chat what you think about the information I presented this evening. It's kind of like taking a drink out of a fire hose, but most people end up telling me that they feel like they needed access to all of this content, and so they wouldn't really want anything taken out. If there is something, however, that wasn't clear, let me know. If there's something that didn't work for you in the chat, let me know. And then also, if there's anything that you found particularly useful or that you know you're going to apply, I would love to hear that in the chat as well. I always read all of the comments, and it really helps me immensely, more than just kind of like what can be found in the polls. So thank you very much. And if you have questions, type them into the Q&A. I will start answering them now. So from Paul, I'm trying to control gravel space under oak trees. I cannot blow the acorns out of the gravel without losing rocks. We'll not even talk about pollen or leaves. Yeah, that's a tough one. Honestly, for me, I mean, sometimes like I've seen pictures from like very high end landscapes where people, sometimes have gravel areas under oak trees. And yeah, I wonder the same thing. I have the one large tree I have in my backyard is an oak tree. It has wood chip mulch underneath it, and we let a lot of the leaves fall and just kind of move them away from the plants underneath. I think it's just always going to be really hard. Oak trees, what they want to live in is like they're in an oak woodland, which is that thick layer of basically their leaves over time. If I'm not sure it's even an option for you, but if it is, just accepting that that might evolve into something where one day you pull the gravel back and it's just kind of a more natural with the wood chip mulch, and then some of the leaves can kind of be there. That's going to be the best thing for the health of the oak tree long term. It kind of creates the soil that it wants and will kind of relieve soil compaction, and that will make things be much more maintainable. I don't know if that's a good answer for you, Paul, but I don't have any other advice for you other than that. Other than the fact that an oak tree is a wonderful thing to have in Southern California, a lot of responsibility, but the shade underneath an oak tree and the amount of bird life and butterfly life it brings to the garden is incredible. Okay. From Jamie, I plan to do the solarization this summer. You make it seem quite doable for my former lawn, now weed area. I'm wondering if after I do that, it would be helpful to do the layer of cardboard and mulch to build the soil. If it is within your means in terms of just like the time and effort you can put in, and if you think you can get a hold of the cardboard, I certainly would do that. That's the approach that I would take. The solarization, depending on the amount of heat you gain, will often kind of work maybe 4 inches, maybe a little deeper. If there is any Bermuda grass left in that lawn, that could have roots down to 10 inches. And so you're going to get pretty good control overall from the solarization. Also, if you're really building up that heat well, it will be enough to sterilize weed seeds, but the sheet mulch is just really going to be some nice insurance. So after you solarize, I would water. If you don't have a good irrigation system at the time that you're doing it, I would, well, if you're going to be sheet mulching, ideally you're going to want to do your irrigation system before the sheet mulch goes down. Or if you're not going to have an irrigation system, just go to the hardware store and get a cheap fan sprinkler so you can really kind of slowly wet that area, because it's going to be really dry after the solarization is complete, even though you start with high moisture. And make sure you get some good deep water in there, like water, dig a hole, make sure that it's really moist, at least a foot down. So if it's dry after a couple inches, water some more, and then do your sheet mulching, and things will be off to a great start. And you'll really have that extra kind of insurance from there to help keep things smothered, anything that wants to grow back. I would absolutely use that as like a best practice kind of plan. From Shauna, I have a big pine tree with grass underneath. The roots are pretty wild spread and visible. How should I remove turf without damaging the roots? Okay, good question. There's no perfect answer, I will say that, but that's pretty common with grass, because the reason why the roots are so high up there is because they're responding to the fact that most of the time with grass, it's like being watered very frequently and just the top 3 or 4 inches of soil. And so that's where the roots start growing. If they are not really above the surface, but just close to the surface, and maybe a couple of them, you can kind of see the woody part of the roots just at the very surface. Most of the time, that cardboard mulch on top of it with shallow roots is the way to go, because it just kind of smothers the lawn down, but you're not disturbing the roots. And that would be my general approach. If there's a few areas where like the roots are like really out like 2-3 inches above the surface of the soil, and there's like lawn in between, sometimes you see that, you can just like very carefully with a trowel or a pick kind of remove in between. There's no perfect answer, but mostly I would try to do the sheet mulching, and kind of, even if there is mulch on top of those roots, which like from like an arborist would tell you is probably not the best, it's still probably a little bit better to have it like that for a while than to like really get in there with a shovel and digging everything up and doing a lot of damage. So hopefully that's helpful. Are there any other questions? I don't see any, so I will say thank you for joining us and good evening, but I will also hang out for a minute while people are filtering out to see if anything else comes in. And please sign up for our newsletter, cbwcd.org/newsletter, if you don't get it already, and join us for future presentations. Good night, everybody.